Okay. Hello and welcome to episode 104 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And I have like a slight mild headache today for some reason, which is unusual for me because I usually don't get headaches unless I got malaria, which hasn't happened in a while. And I also would like to announce that for my birthday, among a few other things, I got a snail. And I named him Righteous Fist of Vengeance, and then he promptly died. So, just a couple days ago, I got a new snail, which I named Righteous Fist of Apocalyptic Chaos. And I used the strategy of carefully observing the snails at the pet store and seeing the one that was like motoring around eating stuff instead of just like being all like closed up, just sitting there at the bottom. And it worked. The strategy worked. And there's a good chance that tomorrow I'll go and get two more because my natural aquarium is getting overrun with algae. And I've already got 3 algae eaters and 1 snail in there. And they're just not holding up their end of the deal. But with that as a preamble, an introduction, if you will, I should start answering questions because we got lots of questions. I'm sorry to announce to you guys with short attention spans that this is going to be a long one in all likelihood because there's more than 50 questions this time. So I'll just wade right in. I'll just dive into this thing. And first I'll have a beverage. So the first question is from Saint Sword, I think, or is Saint's Word. I think it would be Saint Sword, though. It's hard to say. Saint Sword probably knows, however. Anyway, Saint Sword or Saint's Word says, I've been giving serious thought to becoming homeless here in the U.S. to focus on my meditation like a non-ordained monk. I was homeless for 4 years before, so it's not unfamiliar territory to me. However, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how a monk could make it in the U.S. If you weren't dedicated to the letter of the law, but the spirit of it, how could the Vinaya be adapted to U.S. culture? Well, first of all, I'd like to say congratulations to Saint Sword for your noble aspiration here. But I'm not exactly sure what you mean by being homeless. I mean, do you mean like wandering around like a vagrant? Or do you mean just being a monk living in a monastery that technically is not your house? So I'm not exactly sure which. But I mean, if it is the former, which is like the more traditional, I mean, that's what the ancient, like the earliest Buddhist monks did. It's what the earliest Christians did, is you just took off walking. And I mean, it works in like a traditional culture, a traditional spiritual culture like India. In the West, it's very rare. You don't see much of it. Most homeless people are like mentally ill drug addicts, it seems like. Or at least that is the reputation they have acquired for themselves. So one thing that you have to bear in mind, if you really do plan on just throwing yourself at the mercy of the universe and just take off walking with a bowl and robe or some such, sort of like Peace Pilgrim did long ago, is you have to have faith. You have to have faith that if you protect Dhamma, Dhamma will protect you. And then you fling yourself upon the mercy of the universe, and for whatever reason, there's the courage and the renunciation and the dedication to Dhamma and all that acts as like a safety net. You get caught. It's sort of like Krishnamurti used to talk about, you know, the strange flowers in the garden are the ones that get special attention from the gardener. And it's sort of the same way with humans. It's the sort of the strange, unusual humans that really get special attention from heaven or whatever you want to call higher powers. And so it does work, and it can certainly work, but it takes a certain amount of bravery, and it takes the faith of a grain of mustard seed to just fling yourself on the mercy of the universe. Maybe like half a step back from that, I have known at least one monk who lived homeless in the USA, not staying at a monastery even. He stayed at it was like a wildlife refuge outside of San Diego, California. And every morning he would walk into like a soup kitchen and get food. People would just put free food into his bowl, and then he would go back to the wildlife refuge and eat. But he didn't last very long that way. I think it was maybe a couple months tops that he was able to live that way, or at least that he was willing to live that way. Ajahn Chah monks, they'll go for alms round, and when people get to know them, they'll start offering food. I knew a monk in the Tongpulu tradition who went for alms round in America, and he was getting food. I know another American monk who was walking for alms as a monk in San Jose, and he found like a Southeast Asian neighborhood where, after they found out he existed, he was able to get food pretty easily. Also, I've been told that one way that monks can go for alms and really get enough food to live on in America and also in Japan is just to stand outside of a grocery store. So people coming out of the grocery store might put food in their bowl. They think it's cool to see a monk or some religious renunciant standing there silently with a bowl. Otherwise, one might have to actually handle some money. But, there are certain rules you could give yourself. If you're not going to be an ordained bhikkhu, then, there's nothing necessarily immoral with regard to handling money anyway. So you can make some kind of rules where however much money you get, you spend as much as you need for that day, and then just give the rest to somebody who's, poor and gladly handles money. Something like that. But, other possibilities, you could just enter a monastery. If you didn't want to be a monk, you could be like a monastery attendant. You could be ordained as a 10-precept novice, something like that. But it's definitely possible, and it has happened before, and it's going to continue happening in the future, I am sure. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to Saint Sword's next question, which is any thoughts about Johnson versus Grants Pass, which is the Supreme Court decision that made it so states, counties, and cities can now freely make anti-homeless laws and arrest people simply for sleeping outside. Well, Grants Pass, I assume, is Grants Pass, Oregon. And this is just sort of like a movement back in the opposite direction from the way things have been recently, which itself was a move away from exactly the way things are going back now. There used to be vagrancy laws. My father was a hobo back in the Depression, and they had vagrancy laws back then. And then nowadays, there are so many homeless people that have already been mentioned that, it's like an unenforced law in most places. If they were suddenly to crack down on vagrancy, just being homeless, there would be millions of people being crammed into jails or camps or something because there are so many homeless people nowadays. So it may be that if you do become homeless and sleep outdoors, you may want to avoid places like Grants Pass, Oregon, but there's lots and lots of other places that are going to have lots of homeless people. And, I considered as a monk, even just staying like at a homeless camp. That would be a way to be homeless in the West, but chances are you'd probably get like mugged, or, your stuff would be stolen. Not that monks should have very much to get stolen. I almost knocked my emergency backup beverage off the table there. So, yeah, I really don't think that vagrancy laws or anti-vagrancy laws are really going to be like strictly enforced nationwide anytime in the foreseeable future, simply because there are millions and millions of homeless people nowadays. So I'm sure that more liberal jurisdictions, more liberal governments would be way less likely to enforce anti-vagrancy laws, even if such laws existed in that area. And then there may be like hobos back in the 1930s would just put up little codes, at the train stations and so forth, or the freight yards, I guess, since they'd be riding freight trains instead of passenger trains. There'd be little signs they'd put up for, this area is friendly to vagrants, or this friendly cracks down and like does not like vagrants, that kind of thing. That sort of thing will probably get revived, I suppose. So, yeah, it's this Johnson versus Grants Pass. It's just a move back to the way things used to be in the West, where vagrancy was a crime. But considering the way things are now, I really don't think it's going to be strictly enforced in a lot of places. So a person who is adopting a homeless lifestyle for spiritual reasons or for whatever reasons, they're just going to have to learn which places to avoid, I think. So another thing, you can just stay at missions, flop houses, that kind of thing, which is what people used to do, and to some degree probably still do. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Outer Haven. And Outer Haven says, do you have any views on Coleman Hughes? He's an anti-woke moderate Democrat journalist. And I really did not know who Coleman Hughes was. I think the only thing I know about him is that he argued against paying reparations for slavery. That he is a black man, I'm pretty sure. And he's like stood before Congress and gave his case for why the government should not pay reparations to black people for their ancestors being enslaved, well over 100 years ago. And it just makes sense. Punishing people who didn't commit a crime to benefit people who did not have a crime committed against them in this case. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. It's just more handouts to get black people to vote Democrat, I suppose. So, yeah, with regard to Coleman Hughes in particular, I really don't know that much about him other than what I have just said. And so I hope he is at least an honest journalist, because frankly, I would prefer an honest leftist journalist to a dishonest right-wing journalist. Somebody like Glenn Greenwald. I have a certain respect for the guy simply because he says things that most journalists absolutely do not dare to say. He will stand up against the establishment. He will speak truth to power, so to speak. Although it turns out that in the past, when I've started liking a leftist who was honest and had a certain degree of integrity, before very long, he'd just get on the Trump train, and then I'd just be watching another Trump Republican. So, yeah, that's all I know about Coleman Hughes, and most of what I know about honest journalists, because there's really not much to know about them because there's not very many of them anymore. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Mr. Pranav. And Mr. Pranav says, is doing Vandana, visiting, I better just stop right here. Vandana, for those of you who don't know Pali or Sanskrit, it just means like devotionalism, like bowing to altars or images, just devotionalism in general. It's like worshipy. It's like a worshipy aspect of Eastern religion. So I'll just start it over here. Mr. Pranav says, is doing Vandana, visiting monks, taking part in festival and doing all sorts of traditional stuffs helps in enlightenment? Some people were saying it's not important, just doing meditation alone is enough. Oh, some people were saying it's not important, just doing meditation alone is enough. What do you think? Who has better chances at getting enlightened? The first one who practices while doing all the traditional stuff, or some guy who only does meditation at their home without caring a bit about other aspects of Buddhism? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that really just outward actions are ethically neutral. So, if you're doing lots of bowing and visiting monks and going to festivals and just traditional stuff, feeding monks and so forth, the amount of merit you're going to get is going to depend on your volition. It's going to depend on your will, your mental states in general, your attitude. So some people they just do it, like people born into a Buddhist culture, for example, might just do it just because that's what everybody else does. It's just sort of like setting up a Christmas tree at Christmas time or whatever. It's just what you're supposed to do. And that's not entirely bad, but it's not nearly as good as you're doing it because, you have this motivation to do good. So, yeah, definitely people in the West, a lot of people in the West, they'll call themselves Sangha without even keeping 5 precepts. So definitely some of the more basic ethical stuff, like being moral, keeping precepts, telling the truth, that kind of thing. Also, just simplifying and slowing down your life is, it's a kind of, elementary renunciation, which definitely has benefits. So, yeah, it would depend on the individual. Getting back to this question, who has the better chance at getting enlightened? The first person who does all the traditional stuff or the person who just meditates? Yeah, just meditation alone, that's just like using the fine tuning knob without bothering to touch the coarse tuning knob. And that's not so good. It's like trying to carve a statue just with sandpaper before you do the chisel and knife stuff first. So definitely you should do more than just meditate. But all the traditionalism stuff that really is not mentioned very much in the texts, or not really emphasized for bhikkhus especially, it's not really necessary, and it can be a stumbling block too. Like, I lived in Burma, possibly the most Buddhist country in the world, for more than 20 years. And definitely people just get locked in to this traditional viewpoint. They become very dogmatic, and that becomes an obstacle to enlightenment too. So in that case, the more philosophical Westerners might actually have somewhat of an advantage, at least in a lot of cases. So really, it depends on the individual, and what is your attitude, what is your mental state while doing whatever it is that you're doing. And some people might, they might get more benefit from just avoiding the traditionalism stuff. Although visiting monks is good, offering stuff to monks, especially if they're strict, sincere, conscientious monks. You get merit for that. You get good karma. You're gathering up treasures in heaven, so to speak. Going to festivals is really not that big of a deal. And just devotionalism in general, in my opinion, is not that big of a deal. Although some people are more into devotion and faith than others. People with like the more artistic, feelings-oriented temperament might get more advantage out of it than someone who's like the more philosophical, scientific kind of temperament, who's more in their head and less in their heart. Although if you're in your head, you're a head-oriented person, trying to cultivate some heart-centeredness might be good. I mean, it could be helpful, but again, it depends on the individual. One size does not fit all. So you might want to experiment doing different things and see what makes you the most content and serene and mindful, with few desires and all that. So I'm just going to move on to Mr. Pranav's next question, which is, how good were you at practicing Indriya Samvara Sila, and how did you practice it? Well, for a monk, there's 4 kinds of sila, if I remember correctly. One of them, the most basic, or second most basic anyway, is Indriya Samvara Sila. Sila is morality, Indriya is faculties, and Samvara is restraint. So this is the morality of restraining one's sense faculties. And sometimes in the ancient texts, not only ancient Buddhist texts, but I think ancient Jain texts also refer to a monk being like a turtle who just retracts its limbs into its shell. And that's sort of a simile or metaphor for this, like guarding the sense doors, which is restraint of the sense faculties. Although from the Buddhist point of view, there's like the elementary level, which is you just, go into a quiet place, live a quiet, simple lifestyle. You're moral, stay away from the wives of other men, don't go out whoring and gambling and drinking and all that. You just live a simple, harmless, relatively blameless life. And that is a good step towards restraint of the sense faculties, because you are just restraining yourselves and living a simple, quiet kind of life rather than a noisy, complicated kind of life. But then more of a monastic practice, I guess, is where you just become so mindful that you stop having a running commentary on what you are experiencing. So instead of you hear a noise and then you're thinking, wow, what was that noise? Was that the neighbor's dog that got out of their yard again? Maybe I should go tell the neighbor. That kind of thing, where it's like you get a little bit of a sense stimulus, which then triggers these papanchas, these long trains of association. You're just thinking all over the place, and it's all relatively delusional. So you just stay at the level of bare sensory stimulation. Like you hear a noise, it's just you observe the texture of the noise. You're not trying to interpret what caused the noise. What shall I name this noise? It's just you observe the actual quality of the sound as it is impinging on your auditory faculty. And then it's the same with whatever it is that you're seeing. You don't interpret what you're seeing any more than you absolutely have to. You're hearing just all of the senses. If you're eating, just the flavor. You don't say, oh, I like this. This is better than yesterday, or whatever it is. Or maybe it could use a little more salt, or, the crust is a little soggy, that kind of thing. You just observe how it tastes and the textures and everything, and leave it at that. You don't have the running commentary going. So that's essentially what Indriya Samvara Sila is at the higher level. Is you're just being mindful, and just in the seen there is only the seen, in the heard there is only the heard, in the felt there is only the felt, etc. And that applies even to your own mental states, because thoughts are going to arise whether you want them to or not, and then you just kind of don't just let it trigger this long line of association. Like I remember in the Platform Sutra of Hui Neng, which is a Zen sutra, Hui Neng says, you should not allow your thoughts to hook up in sequence. If thoughts arise, they're going to arise due to the power of karma, going from the point of view of Buddhist philosophy. But then you don't just use that as a seed crystal or just a starting point to just start off on some long internal monologue. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to the next one, because we got lots of questions today. And I'd like to keep it less than 4 hours, if you please. If we start getting really more and more people asking questions, which is fine, that's why I'm here. But still, there may be a time in the future when it may go down to a maximum of 2 questions each, possibly even 1 at some point. So, the next question is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, how might a prayer or chant in veneration of the Bodhisatta of Siddhartha Gotama be structured in Pali? Well, Stellar Supreme appears to be a Mahayana Buddhist, because he's using the Sanskrit name of Siddhartha Gotama, spelled G-A-U, instead of Siddhartha Gotama, spelled with an O. But that's all right. We won't hold that against him. The Mahayanas tend to be more devotionalistic anyway, and they might be more inclined to compose a prayer or chant in veneration of Gotama before he became the Buddha. So that's what the Bodhisatta means in Pali. He's someone who's destined to become a Buddha, but hasn't become a Buddha yet. And I've never heard of this in Theravada. There's lots of devotionalistic praise given to the Buddha, as the Buddha, like EDP So Bhagawa, etc., the recollection of the 9 qualities of the Buddha, but they wouldn't apply to the Bodhisatta because he's not the Buddha yet. I mean, most of these qualities he didn't really acquire until he became fully enlightened. So, yeah, you might look through the literature, like Mahayanist literature, if Stellar Supreme is open-minded towards Mahayana Buddhism. I mean, he might just find like a Sanskrit devotionalistic chant or prayer to some other bodhisatta, and then just kind of make the few adjustments required to switch it over to Gotama, who is like the original Buddhist bodhisatta in what we call Buddhism today, because all the other bodhisattas were later developments after the Buddha was like the first bodhisatta called a bodhisatta in historical times, setting aside other Buddhisms in other world systems and so forth. So yeah, that would be my best advice. I mean, I'm not just gonna off the cuff with my very rusty Pali come up with some devotionalistic chant in praise of the Buddha before he became the Buddha, of Gotama, the philosopher Gotama, the bodhisatta, the being destined for enlightenment or Buddhahood. So yeah, that would probably be my best bet. Would, if you can't find one online, for example, and you can find just about anything online, if you can't find some devotionalistic chant dedicated to the Buddha before his enlightenment, and I'm not exactly sure why someone would do this, but you can just find some other devotionalistic chant dedicated to some other bodhisatta, and then just make the necessary adjustments, which might be difficult if you're not skillful in Pali or Sanskrit, but it can be done. But devotionalism really has never been my strong point. And I've never really chanted in veneration of any bodhisatta, although when I was young, before I was a monk, when I would light incense or something, offer it up to all the Buddhas and, all the sages, which would include bodhisattas, I suppose. All the holy people. So, yeah, I'm of limited value with regard to advice on devising prayers or chants in veneration of bodhisattas or bodhisattvas. But it can be done, I am sure. And like I say, your best bet might be just take a pre-existing chant towards some other like a Mahayana bodhisattva, and then just make the necessary adjustments so that it fits Gotama before he became enlightened. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam's next question, which is, what is the karma of disparaging common worldlings or normies regarding wallowing in sensuality if it's done in a firm but constructive way? Well, it depends on your mental states. It's this way in the West and in the East too. I shouldn't pick on Westerners, but in the East too, they just think that a physical action just has a certain karma, and if you do this physical action, you're just gonna, as a necessary consequence of doing the physical action, you're gonna get this result. And there's lots of examples. Like anyone who's read George Orwell's Burmese Days knows that U Po Chin, who is the villain of the story, the main villain, he was doing all this bad stuff, and his wife was warning him that he's gonna go to hell because he's a bad man. He says, "You don't know anything. I'm gonna build a pagoda." Because the Burmese think that if you build a pagoda, it's practically a stairway to heaven. You're getting such merit for building that pagoda. Or, let's see, what was another good example? Oh yeah, like I lived at this monastery out in the forest in Burma. And sometimes a fortune teller would tell somebody, you need good karma, so what you need to do is rescue a chicken from a butcher, turn it loose at the forest monastery. Let it go free. So some people would come with these little fluffy, downy baby chickens like this. And I'd say that baby chicken is going to survive 2 days tops, because there are hawks and falcons and monitor lizards and all sorts of things that like to eat baby chickens. And that baby chicken doesn't have a chance. And the person who's fortune teller told them to release the chicken, they don't care. They don't want to hear this. They just get this sick look on their face. Like, I don't want to hear this. I've been told I turn a chicken loose and I'm going to get good karma for it. And it just doesn't work that way. So getting back to the question here of disparaging common worldlings or normies regarding wallowing in sensuality, if it's done in a firm but constructive way, if you do it with love in your heart, you do it out of compassion to them, then even if they respond negatively, I mean, that's on them. Their reaction is their action. But I mean, if you are trying to help and you're doing it in a loving, brotherly kind of way, then even if you might adopt a stern tone or something, still what you're doing is predominantly good. If you've got good motivations, positive motivations, you're making good, positive karma, wholesome karma. And if you do it out of like anger or disgust, contempt, anything like that, that's going to be negative mental states motivating the action, which is going to result in negative karma and negative fruition of that karma. So again, it depends on the individual and the individual's attitude and intentions and mental states. So moving on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam's next question, which is there any record of a monk walking around conversing and whatnot while maintaining samadhi? Yeah, there are cases of that. Like, there's a story, I think it's in the commentaries, of a monk who was meditating on the 32 parts of the body, especially bones, so that when he would be walking around interacting with people, and I think it might have been Ajahn Mun who did this for a while too, they're just they're meditating on bones to such a degree that when they see people, they're just seeing walking skeletons. And I think it might have been Ajahn Mun or Ajahn Mahabua or somebody of that caliber who would have to identify people by their teeth, because that's the only way he could distinguish them. And so, I mean, you're still interacting while at the same time, you're still just so absorbed in your object of meditation that everything is translated through that. Or just being mindful. I mean, he's talking about samadhi here, but I mean, mindfulness. It is possible to have a conversation mindfully. I've had that spontaneously happen when I was a monk in Burma. I remember walking back and forth with this old man, supporter of mine, a really good guy. If he's still alive, he might be 100 years old now. And I was so used to meditating. I'm walking back and forth, hanging out with him. And I just keep being mindful of like the vibration in my throat and the movements of my mouth and so forth when I'm talking. And it's like the conversation is just nature taking its course. I'm not even really deciding what I'm going to say. I'm just observing this conversation taking place with emphasis on observing, like the tactile sensations of, vibration of the vocal cords and just the sound of the talking and the movement of my mouth and so forth. But that's more a matter of mindfulness rather than concentration. So I guess we just go back to the old story in the commentaries about bones. So, I mean, it is possible. It does happen. And like a fully enlightened being would have profound concentration no matter what they're doing, one would assume. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, a few Q&As ago, you mentioned that Orthodox Theravada doesn't have a concept of the subconscious mind in the Freudian or Jungian sense. This made me think of a few questions about Buddhism's relationship to the subconscious mind. So the first of these questions is, how was the mind understood in the West before Freud? I don't know much about the history of psychology, so I guess as someone who's grown up in a post-Freud world, it's hard for me to understand how people believed the mind worked before his time. I've heard that Kant believed that all thoughts are driven by emotions and that our emotions ultimately govern our actions, but that was very close to Freud's time and pointed out by revolutionary philosopher, which is not representative of the common Westerner at the time. Well, it has changed. Like in classical Greece and Rome, I think a lot of people believe that our thoughts were largely implanted into us by gods. And let's see. But I mean, that's kind of a strange psychology that's more verging towards theology. I think there have always been people that had deep insight into human nature. Like Dostoevsky was pre-Freudian, and he had a profound appreciation and understanding of human nature. I mean, he was able to portray, really deep aspects of human psychology in his fiction without having the theories like Freud came up with. So you can understand something just through experience without having to formulate theories to account for it. People knew about gravity, for example, long before Isaac Newton came along and came up with an equation for gravity. So there's that. And I think, there's always been weird theories, like John Locke may have been one of the originators of the tabula rasa, just the blank slate idea that human beings have no animal instincts at all, no innate knowledge. It's all just, we're just a blank slate at birth, which a lot of leftists are falling back to, even though it's pre-scientific and kind of pseudo-scientific at this point. It's obviously untrue, but Karl Marx, he was pretty much pre-Freudian, pre-Darwinian also, they really didn't have any appreciation for the fact that human beings have animal instincts, that we are a species of animal laden with animal instincts. Even the mid-20th century, even up into like the 1980s, it was just common understanding, I won't say common knowledge, of psychologists who supposedly are scientists, that humans have almost no animal instincts. There's like the suckling instinct in babies. Newborn babies instinctively know how to swim, and they lose that ability if they don't get taught to swim, or they don't get experience at swimming during their first several months. But we're just loaded with animal instincts. We are a species of animal. And so even in ancient times, people would be aware of certain aspects, like men identify with their thoughts, women identify with their feelings more, not just entirely. Men don't entirely identify with their thoughts, but they're more inclined to be that way. Women are more inclined to be more feelings oriented. Stuff like this, people have known probably since the Stone Age. It's just that it wasn't formulated into scientific theories. So it's hard to say exactly what pre-modern or pre-Freudian psychology was like. Yeah, but there have been people who had just had a profound understanding of human nature without necessarily having to learn any like psychological theories. Just as there are people who are excellent horse riders who never had to learn horsemanship at an academy or anything, or they're really good archers without having to learn archery other than just practicing themselves. They didn't have theories about it, they just did it. So I would assume that most of the deep understanding of how the human mind works was just done empirically through observation, and the more observant, intelligent people would have maybe deeper insights with regard to how things work than other people, more superficial kind of people. Which isn't much of an answer to your question, maybe. But, I also am no authority on pre-Freudian psychology. So, he was sort of like the Isaac Newton, or maybe even the Galileo of psychology. And so studying physics before Galileo, there kind of wasn't physics before Galileo, and there kind of wasn't psychology before Freud. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Xenothoid. And that is as follows. Do you believe that the historical Buddha believed in a subconscious or unconscious mind? He obviously understood that the mind has multiple working components, as he lays out in his model of the five aggregates. He posited that thoughts, emotions, and perceptions of mental and physical phenomena are all interrelated and simultaneously conditioning each other, showing that he obviously believed that the mind has depth and doesn't just randomly shit out thoughts and feelings. Yeah, he actually said that. The mind doesn't just randomly shit out thoughts and feelings. This question was asked on the Discord server, and one person with a certain amount of insight actually pointed out that the Buddhist idea of anusyas, or latent tendencies, might qualify as a kind of Buddhist subconscious mind, although it's sort of latent tendencies because they're not really, I mean, in a way, they're not really conscious yet. You know, you have a latent tendency to react to a certain stimulus in a certain way. So long as that stimulus isn't happening, it's not like, you know, you've got that part of your mind just kind of waiting for its opportunity. It's just sort of latent, it's dormant. But still, karma in general is a mental state. It is volition. And karma in general also could qualify as a kind of subconscious mind. You know, it's like you are creating your reality as a result of karma, but you're not doing it at a conscious level. And so somebody who's fully enlightened, who just sees right through everything, yeah, he would know about that. He might not explain it in a scientific way, though. I mean, he just might grok it. You know, he just intuitively sees and understands it without formulating laws or anything about exactly how it works. And the Buddhist way of looking at things would be very different from the scientific way of looking at things anyway. Because it's like, I mean, Buddhism, early Buddhism especially, was also not only pre-Freudian, pre-Darwinian, pre-scientific. And so they just assumed that we aren't really animals. In fact, they really didn't have a really deep appreciation of animal psychology either. So, yeah, it'd just be like a way of looking at reality, just like the ancient Indian way, just setting aside fully enlightened beings for the moment. The ancient Indian way of looking at reality in certain ways would be superior to the modern Western way or postmodern Western way of looking at reality, but it would be very different. Just different assumptions that you're starting off with, different cultural conditioning, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I do not think that the Buddha would be ignorant of the workings of the subconscious mind, because he would see the mind way better than we do, way better than Freud did, way better than any clinically trained psychologist, unless they somehow became fully enlightened. So, yeah, I think, just remembering past lives and so forth, that might be accessing deep subconscious levels of your own mentality. So he would be able to get down to that. Like, even psychic powers in general would require getting down below the superficial ego, which is really not all there is to mind. I think a lot of people just assume that the conscious surface level of their mind is the only, that's what their mind is. You know, they're unaware of the fact that most of their mind is not this superficial ego. That there's all kinds of things going on at deeper levels that the superficial ego that calls itself me doesn't know. And so a fully enlightened being would just be able to see through all the levels. So, but I mean, he couldn't really start teaching psychology to ancient Indians, partly because they wouldn't understand it or they wouldn't get it, and partly because it wasn't even necessary to know that stuff in order to become enlightened. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Zenithoid. And he says, to me, there seems to be an issue between the Freudian Jungian model of mind and the Buddhist model, in that Freud and Jung very firmly believed in a self, while Buddhism explicitly denies it. I often see Westerners, particularly Jungians, equate the subconscious unconscious with the soul. In Buddhism, there's no singular and everlasting thing that mental phenomena rest upon, become part of, or bounce off of. Let's see, I have to start at that sentence here. At the beginning here. In Buddhism, there's no singular and everlasting thing that mental phenomena rest upon, bounce off of, or are filtered through, because every part of the mind is subject to dependent origination. Does this mean that the Freudian or Jungian model and the doctrine of anatta are fundamentally contradictory? I wonder what a debate between Siddhartha Gautama and a Freud or Jung on the nature or structure of the mind would have looked like. Well, the thing is, Freud and Jung were unenlightened. They were stuck in a samsaric context, whereas the Buddha was not stuck in a samsaric context. So, from the samsaric perspective, you can say that there is a self, you can say there's a subconscious mind, etc. But at the level of ultimate reality, which unenlightened people really can't appreciate, then there is no self. Period. So they're not necessarily contradictory any more than samsara and nibbana are contradictory. It's just that it's two different levels of reality. One is like a conditional virtual level of reality, and the other one is the absolute level of reality. So like theories of psychology and human nature and so forth would apply to the samsaric level of virtual reality, whereas no self is more applicable, obviously more applicable to ultimate reality. It's paramatta satya, ultimate truth, and not conventional truth. Conventional truth, you can say, sure, there's a self. Even the Buddha was talking about, make an island unto yourself, that kind of a thing. He's talking about this person and that person and me and you and him and her, as though they were real, which is just Wohara Desana. It's just using samsaric language to communicate to samsaric beings. But above that is the ultimate, which is without self, without individuality. So yeah, if there was a debate, I don't think the Buddha would actually debate, but you could have sort of a Socratic dialogue between Gautama Buddha and Sigmund Freud. I think Jung would probably fare better, since Sigmund Freud was just like a complete atheist. Jung was rather more spiritual than Freud. So I think Jung and the Buddha might actually meet with some agreement and, get along better than Freud, who might just turn up his nose at this ignorant Indian fakir or whatever, however he would interpret the Buddha, because he believed all religion was essentially bullshit, I'm pretty sure. So he would consider the Buddha to be a bullshitter, so to speak. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Kriel, who in a previous Q&A gave me permission to pronounce his name any way I saw fit. But whether he really doesn't mind me calling him throat warbler mangrove, I don't know. Anyway, Kriel, alias throat warbler mangrove, says, simple question, where is the Buddha now? Well, it may be so simple that there's no answer, because that is essentially one of the questions that the Buddha refused to answer. That is, what happens to a Tathagata? What happens to a Buddha after death? He would not answer the question. So, if the Buddha doesn't answer it, how am I going to answer, where is the Buddha now? He's off the scale. Samsara really is irrelevant to the Buddha. The Buddha himself, just the Buddha as an individual would be purely samsaric anyway. Because, as I just said, in ultimate reality, there is no individuality. So, yeah, it's not as simple as it seems, because that is one of the questions the Buddha refused to answer. What happens to a Tathagata after death? You can't even really say if a Tathagata exists even before death. To say yes is invalid. To say no is invalid. To say yes and no is invalid. To say neither yes nor no is invalid. All options are invalid. So, yeah, it's not so simple of a question. I'm just going to move on to the next one. This is from GameFap. And GameFap says, who is your favorite fictional Buddhist? And then I think GameFap asked this under the previous Q&A uploaded onto YouTube. And somebody else responded by saying it was Kwai Chang Caine, which actually I might not have even thought of Kwai Chang Caine from the old TV show Kung Fu, about this Shaolin Buddhist monk who kills the imperial nephew, kills the emperor's nephew, and then has to flee China. This is back in the 1800s. And goes to America because his father was an American who had lived in China and married a Chinese woman. And so, yeah, maybe Kwai Chang Caine, possibly. I mean, Master Po, the blind Master Po, he was definitely wiser than Kwai Chang was. But then again, my favorite fictional Buddhist also could possibly be, and this is controversial now. Get ready, brace yourselves. But it could be Holden Caulfield in J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. And I remember a long time ago, an American monk, when we were both in Burma at the time, we're sitting out in front of my cave, and he's saying that The Catcher in the Rye is considered by many Buddhists to be a Buddhist book. And I just thought that was just silly at the time. But then, after reading essentially the sequel to The Catcher in the Rye, the sequel, which is a book called Franny and Zooey, it became plainly obvious that the whole thing, the Catcher in the Rye and also Franny and Zooey after that, was a kind of allegory, like a Buddhist allegory. So Holden Caulfield was kind of a bodhisattva, even though it's all an allegory and most people don't realize it. Just like most people who read Lord of the Flies don't realize that is just an allegory from start to finish. That everything in the book represents something else symbolically. So yeah, Kwai Chang Caine, or maybe Holden Caulfield, if you want to be controversial. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Satori Enjoyer. And Satori Enjoyer says, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Vipassana practice and tradition? Is it really different in the US from in Burma or Asia in general? Well, there really is no the Vipassana practice and tradition. First of all, Vipassana is really not a good name for what it's applied to. Vipassana, like the Vipassana practice, is essentially satipatthana. Vipassana isn't something that you do. Vipassana is insight which arises. And Vipassana can arise if you're practicing mindfulness, like satipatthana, or if you're practicing concentration, like you're practicing jhana. Vipassana can arise in either way. So it might be better to refer to it as satipatthana. But I mean, there's different kinds of Vipassana. Even in Burma, they talk about, doing Vipassana, but there's different schools. You've got Mahasi style Vipassana. You've got Goenka style Vipassana, which a lot of people just assume that Vipassana is the Goenka method in the West. Then you've got who is it? Mogote. And then there's another one. I think it's the Mogote method that puts a lot of emphasis on when you're meditating on like an orthodox interpretation of Paticca Samuppada, like the 12 links. And a lot of the time you're listening to tapes or recordings of people explaining dependent co-arising, and that also is called Vipassana. So each school will have its own interpretation of Vipassana, or like some kind of meditation practice that doesn't use jhana necessarily. That it's more based on mindfulness than on sitting in really deep meditative states like jhana. So what are the strengths and weaknesses? It depends on what school it is. I mean, it could be that Satori Enjoyer thinks Vipassana is essentially the Goenka method. The strengths of the Goenka method is, I mean, at least you're taking meditation seriously. They do take keeping 5 precepts seriously. You're not allowed to do a longer retreat than the standard 10-day retreat, I'm pretty sure. I think they're called courses, unless you have been meditating 2 hours a day for something like 2 years. So, I mean, it's strong in that sense, in just like a traditional conservative interpretation of basic Dhamma practice. Although the weaknesses of the Goenka method, it turned into kind of a cult of personality based on S.N. Goenka himself, and it's very simplified and streamlined. It ignores most of Buddhist philosophy and just emphasizes like Goenka's interpretation of practicing Vipassana and whatever philosophical teachings happen to reinforce and support that. So, but with regard to Mahasi or something, I mean, one of the weaknesses of people who don't practice jhana is they're really missing out on the most subtle states. And like I keep saying, even according to the stock standard description of the 4 jhanas, 4th jhana is called purity of mindfulness. So if you want perfect mindfulness, you got to attain 4th jhana, which is not Vipassana. That's samatha. That's doing the samadhi stuff. So I think one of the weaknesses of Vipassana is the very idea of splitting Theravada Buddhism into 2 schools or 2 sasanas. Sometimes in Burma, they'll ask you, what sasana do you follow? Vipassana sasana or samatha sasana? But really, I don't think that the Buddha divided his teachings up into 2 different roads, 2 different paths that really they're supposed to be integrated. That when you're sitting in meditation, you cultivate the deeper samadhi states. And when you're moving around making noise, then it's more important to be mindful of, like Indriya Samarasila, like restraint of the sense doors, and just being mindful and aware of like whatever stimulations are impinging upon your sensorium, so to speak. So, there's another question here. Satori Enjoyer, that sly devil, he asked a 2-part question, which adds up all of his questions to 4. Because the second half of that question is it really different in the US from in Burma or Asia in general? Well, in Burma, the main difference is there's different kinds of Vipassana. There's more different schools of like Theravada Buddhism, including Vipassana emphasis on Buddhism in Burma. There's all these different schools. There's a Theravada method and Mogot method and Shui Umin, Mahasi, of course, Tangpulu, Sunlun. There's all these different schools with their own interpretation of Vipassana or of practice in general. And also, it's just more conservative. They put way more emphasis on the importance of monks. They put way more emphasis on, feeding monks and doing the ceremonies and, doing all the stuff that was asked about earlier on in this Q&A, just all the traditional stuff. They're just born into it. It's like water to a fish. Whereas in the West, there's all this political stuff that's got mixed in, and it's been very watered down. And the difficult stuff that they can't do is avoided or ignored. And respect for monks is much decreased in general, and just on and on. So, yeah, I think you'd still be better off practicing Vipassana at an Asian center like in Burma than you would at someplace like Spirit Rock. Although there are good places like Tathagata Meditation Center in San Jose is a good place for practicing Mahasi method, pretty much like you'd be practicing it in Burma. It's run by a Vietnamese group that have converted over to the Burmese Mahasi tradition. So I guess I'll just move on to Satori Enjoyer's next question. Can the Sangha in the US survive the boomers who remade American Buddhism for their original version of woke ideology and are still the major source of revenue for it dying? Any ideas for what might come after the boomer lib sangha? Well, one possibility that comes to mind is that you're going to have Western monasticism supported largely by Asian immigrants from, immigrants from Buddhist countries. And that's like the Ajahn Chah tradition receives a lot of support from like the Thai community, local Thai communities. So you could have Western monks supported largely at first, especially by Asian immigrants. And then a lot of people will see that this really is a high quality product. And I want to support this too. And you'll have more and more Westerners supporting serious monastic Buddhism in the West. And probably after the boomers have faded away, there'll be less of a stereotype of Western Buddhists being loony leftists, flying rainbow flags and so forth. I mean, being open-minded about and tolerant of homosexuality, queerness, that sort of thing is fine. But really, when it becomes like an ideological statement, promoted in the Dhamma halls, then, I mean, especially the stuff that really is contrary to what early Buddhism taught. So let's see here. I almost started ranting there, and I kind of lost the thread. So can the Sangha in the U.S. survive the boomers? I think so, and I think they might do well. I mean, the population of Western Buddhists might go down a bit, but it's going to be a lot of deadwood is going to be lost. And I think all in all, it may be beneficial once you get sort of the leftist activists. But there's like a whole new generation of leftist activists, especially in academia. I mean, you read some academic papers, like Buddhist, in quotes here, Buddhist academic papers that are coming out lately by middle-aged people who are, Gen X at the oldest. And it's worse than what the boomers were teaching. It's just the queering of Buddhism, for example. So, and then all this stuff about, mindfulness of white privilege and mindfulness of inherent racism and, 50% off for all people of color to attend the retreats, which is discriminatory, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, it might become more polarized. You're going to have like the more conservative, traditionalist, monastic emphasis on Buddhism, which will be supported largely by Asian communities with hopefully more and more Westerners really seeing that this is more of a true Dhamma than this other stuff that is just drifting farther and farther away from what the Buddha originally taught. So I don't think that it's a bad thing. I'm not black-pilled on that at all. So I'm just going to move on to Satori Enjoyer's next question, which is, can you say anything about the idea that citta, or mind, does achieve awakening and remains after nibbana? It seems from what I have read of Thai forest tradition Theravada that this is the case to that tradition. Does that contradict anatta? Well, there are a lot of Thai ajahns who do talk about the citta as the knower. It's in a way they're sort of making a self out of consciousness, or the observing mind, which is not strictly orthodox. They've adopted more of like a Vedantist interpretation of the case, of the human condition of mentality. Which technically speaking is not orthodox. But let's see. Citta does not achieve anything. To the extent that you've got, like, let's say, for the sake of argument, that ultimate reality is infinite formless consciousness, and there are a couple of suttas in the texts that do support that idea, that like nirvana is infinite formless consciousness, but you don't reify the absolute, and so you don't refer to it as this it that exists. You just kind of avoid talking about it as much as possible. So, if reality, ultimate reality, is infinite formless consciousness, it's not going to achieve anything. All you're doing is you're fading out and just leaving that behind, which was always the same long before you came along. Sort of like God. So, yeah, that would be how I would interpret it. So, yeah, and to some degree, what certain Thai Ajahns teach is really unorthodox and does contradict anatta, which doesn't necessarily disqualify their wisdom. It's just that Thai Ajahns are less scholarly and less dogmatic than Burmese Sayadaws, for example, partly because back in like the 1800s, I think, the Burmese sacked the capital of Thailand, which was Ayutthaya at the time, and it was like their ecclesiastical schools and everything just collapsed as a result of that and never fully recovered. So Burmese Sayadaws are very scholarly and very dogmatic. They know what is orthodox and what is not orthodox as a general rule, whereas the Thais, bless their hearts, they base their understanding of Dhamma more on their own personal experience, which obviously has its benefits, but they might use unorthodox ways of explaining that, which then sort of through the back door makes them into heretics, sort of. So Chitta doesn't achieve awakening because Chitta is the awakening that is achieved. It's just that we have like this very limited version of Chitta, which then once this perverse belief that we exist as an individual just dissolves, then it just becomes wide open. You have access, well, I mean, just all of Chitta is there in its formless majesty, its formless infinitude, so to speak. But again, referring to it as an it, referring to it as it is, as though it were a thing, kind of drags it into samsara, and it's not samsaric. Nibbana is not samsaric. And if we interpret Nibbana as infinite formless consciousness, which is unmanifest, luminous all around, as the texts say, then it's not something that achieves anything. It's just always there, and it's just that our knowledge of it is obscured because we are delusional. So it's sort of like a Buddhist godhead, sort of like Brahman in Vedanta. I'm just going to move on to the next question now. This is from Arain. And Arain asks me a surprisingly difficult question, which is kind of also an easy question because I just don't know the answer to it. So I can just say, I don't know, and move on to the next one. But anyways, Arain's question is, Gandhi was said to have a massive interest in the occult. What do you know about this, and where would be the best resource on this subject? Well, I've read Gandhi's autobiography, and I also read a biography of him by Lewis Fisher, and I don't recall either one of them really discussing the occult. The most occult thing I can think of with regard to Mahatma Gandhi or Mohandas K. Gandhi is that he practiced meditation, and his favorite meditation method was the Ramanama, just repeating Ram over and over again, which kind of could get you into some sort of occult state, maybe. But if he did have a massive interest in the occult, I suppose if you wanted to learn about that, you might just do a search on, Mahatma Gandhi occult, something like that, and some kind of essays or studies or something might come up about that. Why he would remain silent about his interest in the occult or fascination with the occult, I don't know. Unless maybe, it was years ago that I read the autobiography and the biography, so maybe I just don't remember him talking about his fascination with the occult. But yeah, I guess your best bet, if you wanted to learn more about it, just do a search on the internet, Mahatma Gandhi occult, and see what comes up. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from White Ash Piper. White Ash Piper says, if it's true that there is no self, then how can murder or war be bad karma? Momentum make a judgment call? Why would it be that the world is delusional How did that happen? Well, how can murder or war be bad karma? Well, if there is no self at the ultimate level. At the ultimate level, there also is no murder, no war, and not even any karma. At the ultimate level, you've got, like I was saying just like a couple minutes ago, infinite formless consciousness, undifferentiated, unmanifest, luminous all around. So there's no war or bad karma or murder or self in any of that. So at the level, the samsaric level, where there is a self, or at least there seems to be one, there also seems to be murder and war and bad karma. But when you transcend the self, you transcend all of that samsaric bullshit. So it's difficult. Some people, and I hope White Ash Piper isn't one of these, but they just cannot deal with more than one level of reality at the same time. But that's essentially what we got with Nibbana and Samsara. It's two different levels of reality. And they coexist. So let's see here. Momentum makes a judgment call. Yeah, well, karma is like the psychic momentum of your mind. It's the momentum of your mental states. And some people think, well, how can mere momentum make choices? Well, I mean, it's dependently co-arising. There are causes for the choices. And it's tinged with this ultimately real consciousness, which may actually add a certain amount of freedom in some mysterious, paradoxical way. So that's kind of one question. And then he also asked, why would it be that the world is delusional? How did that happen? Well, I assume most of you have already heard the simile of the block of marble umpteen times. The block of marble, you've got a sizeless, let's just call it sizeless, block of stone. It contains within it every single possible statue. Every single atom, every single molecule is already in the exact place it has to be for that statue to be there. You just have to remove the extraneous rock, generally with your imagination. That's how the sculptor does it at first. And so they're all in there. I mean, they really are all in there. And some of those statues are so complex that they become recursive. They become self-aware. And then they start thinking that they are real and separate from all the rest of the rock. So then they make virtual judgment calls. And that's how the world is delusional. Well, if you want another explanation, I've given this explanation more than once also, is that in order for there to be multiplicity in this world, in this cosmos, in order for there to be a difference between shit and shinola, in order for there to be a difference between this and that, there has to be relations. That's how perception works. First, you've got the papancha element of perception, which like differentiates things. And then you've got like papancha sankha, you got the sankha aspect, which is giving a name to it. So to perceive something, you first separate a figure from ground, and then you identify that figure. You give it a name, or even if it's just a that, or what the hell is that? Still, you've got to single it out and separate it from the rest of everything else. But in order to do that, it takes relations. Same as, different from. You got to have some kind of way of differentiating figure from ground. And these ways of differentiating figure from ground are purely psychological. They don't exist out there. There is no pure same as or different from that can be extracted from a sample of matter. A chemist can analyze a sample of matter and just divide it down into its constituent components. He's never going to be able to isolate pure same as or different from. That's all psychological, that's all mental. But without same as and different from, you just have this undifferentiated, essentially a void. So, let's see. Did I answer the question? If it is true there is no self, then how can murder or war be bad karma? Yeah, I already answered that. How could there be bad karma for that matter? Momentum, make a judgment call? Yeah, okay, I think I answered that. Came close enough to answering it anyhow. And why would it be that the world is delusional? Yeah, I pretty much answer that too. Thinking that what is constructed in your mind is really out there. That is delusional. How did that happen? Well, whatever can happen does happen and must happen and will always happen, because it's statues in that block of marble that are always going to be there no matter what we do. The best we can do is transcend it, but still the deluded us that hasn't transcended it yet is still going to remain in there, which is kind of too bad, really. But that's just the way it is, at least according to me. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovak and Sipad Zidana. And Siovak and Sipad Zidana says, how come anytime people have past life memories, it's always a human memory? Don't ever see someone mentioning memories of being a monkey, shark, lizard, some alien species, or some incomprehensible kind of existence. Instead, it's almost always someone in a very relatable human context that someone can make up in their imagination. Well, it has to be something conceivable. I mean, if it's beyond your capacity to conceive, you're not going to conceive it. But it is true in Burma, some people do have animal past life memories, and possibly even like ghost or deva kind of past life memories. But it's all like traditional Orthodox Buddhism that is well within their range of stuff that they've learned through cultural conditioning. But like Pa Seattle, in one of his books, talks about some woman who had a past life regression during meditation of being an elephant. And I was at a Tanjidong retreat where a woman had a past life regression of being a dragon, I think. I mean, she was making these weird kind of growly noises in the back of her throat, causing the teacher to get up and go and attend to her immediately, because it was like weird sounds this woman was making. But yeah, I've never heard of anyone having a past life regression as some sort of alien being with tentacles breathing liquid ammonia or anything like that. I think one of the main reasons, there's two main reasons that can come to mind as why when people have past life regressions, they remember being a person and not a non-human. One is that it's their subconscious imagination conjuring this stuff up, like through hypnotic trance, that kind of a thing. A lot of the time, it's just your subconscious imagination conjuring up this really vivid imagination, this imaginary past life regression, because you're told to remember a past life, and so you dutifully just conjure one up in your imagination. I'm sure that happens a lot of the time. So that's one. Another explanation of why past life regressions are usually people is because most of us were people in our past lives, our past several lives anyway. It's just that we have human karma, so it causes us to be reborn as humans as a general rule. Our momentum is moving in a human direction. And, we might be getting into a more refined human level. We might have started off as crude barbarians with no sense of compassion or whatever, and we're gradually getting wiser and better. We're becoming more saintly or sagely kind of humans, but still, for most of us, we are on a human trajectory. You die as a human, you've got predominantly human karma, so that causes you to be reborn as a human again. So that's another reason. Those would be the two main reasons. Take your pick. You pays your money and you takes your choice. So I'm just going to move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's next question, which I don't fully understand because I think he failed in the grammar department in this question. But I will proceed. Maybe I'll figure it out reading it this time. In Jainism, there are two main branches, with the most obvious distinction being that one sect has naked monks like Mahavira was, while the other sect has monks wears white cloth. Do the Buddhist texts ever describe what the monastics of the Jain tradition as naked like their leader? So Siovak and Sipad Zidana gets a D at best in English grammar on this one. Does the Buddhist text ever describe what the monastics of the Jain tradition as naked like their leader. I think maybe he's asking if the Buddhist texts ever describe Jains as being naked. In which case, yeah, I mean, they would belong with the naked ascetics. So, yeah, the Ajivikas were pretty much all naked, I'm pretty sure. And the Jains and the Ajivikas were closely related. I think it may be that Makali Gosala, who was one of the leaders of the Ajivikas in the Buddhist time, at one point was a disciple of Mahavira. It could be vice versa, but I think it was Makali Gosala, the Ajivika, who had gone to the Jain Mahavira for spiritual instruction at some point. So, I think Jains were generally described as naked in the Buddhist text, if their clothing was described at all, or their lack of same, that they generally fit under the category of the naked ascetics. They were like the hardcore radicals who looked down their nose on the Buddhist monks as like shaven-headed householders because they wallow in sensuality. Like they are able to wear sandals. You know, they can use a sunshade if they want to. They can accept invitations to people's houses and eat good food there. So, but I have read some Jain texts. And I've mentioned this before. It's one of the weirdest rules that in the Jain text that I ever came across. It's like a Jain has to cross a river. There's no ferry. There's no bridge. How is he going to cross that river? He can only cross the river in a boat if the boat was going to cross over anyway. Because if the boat goes over just to take this Jain ascetic across, the Jain is making karma by doing that. And the whole religion, the whole philosophy of Jainism, at least at this level, is you exhaust all of your karma. Good karma, bad karma. You don't make any new karma. You avoid making new karma. So you're not allowed to accept food from somebody if there's a hungry dog sitting nearby, because you might be depriving that dog of a meal, which would make karma for yourself. Even if there's lots of flies buzzing around, you're not allowed to accept food there because you might be depriving those flies of food. So you can't cross the river if they're going to take you across, especially because that's making new karma. So if the boat's already going to go across and you're just able to get on it and go across with everybody else, if the boat starts to sink, you're not allowed to help bailing out, because that would be making karma. It might be making good karma, but that doesn't matter. You want to get rid of all of your karma. So what you're supposed to do is, if you're the kind of Jain that wears clothes, you take your clothes off and you fold it up and put it on top of your head, so that when the owner of the boat gets pissed off at you and throws you overboard for not helping to bail it out, your clothes won't get so wet. And that's in ancient Jain texts, although possibly not the edition of Jain texts that exists in the Buddhist time, because the Jains lost their texts twice, I think, simply because they were such ascetics that there were fewer scholar monks. Like, unlike the Buddhists, there were fewer scholastic Jains that memorized this stuff. And so eventually their scriptures got lost because there were no monks left who had memorized them. So they had to have councils, like a Buddhist great council, to kind of restructure like a Jain body of canonical texts. So at least by the time they got to the body of text that exists today, that Jains were like Digambara or sky-clad, and I can't remember what the ones that wore white were called. Svetambara, something like that. So I hope I answered that question, but I'm not exactly sure what Styxhexenhammer and Sipadzirna was asking. So I'm just going to move on to Styxhexenhammer and Sipadzirna's third question, which is, do you support the 969 movement? And I'm relatively indifferent to the 969 movement. I did not participate in it in any way. I did not support or detract. You know, it was just something going on in Burma when I was there. And I hear a little bit about it from time to time, but I just did not get involved. So I do not support it, but I have not detracted from it or gone against it. I'm not for or against. And for those Oh boy. Godzilla. Okay, so let's see. What was I saying? 969 movement. Oh yeah, for those of you who don't know what the 969 movement is, it's a movement in Burma to keep Burma Buddhist. Mainly is to try to keep Burma from being taken over by Muslims. And so there are some monks who are really outspoken in their distaste for allowing Muslims into the country and for possibly even removing the Muslims that exist already in the country. And yeah, it just really didn't have anything to do with me. And so I just really, it was just something that I would hear about sometimes. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin said, did your foot constantly fall asleep when you meditated? I've been meditating for a long time and this doesn't seem to go away. No, it didn't constantly fall asleep. Every once in a while, one of my feet would fall asleep, usually the top one. Like if you're sitting in the full lotus, you know, you kind of have your legs kind of like this. And let's see, the top foot here was the one that would, or would it be this one? Well, anyways, one of them would fall asleep sometimes. But if you sat long enough, generally the feeling would come back. It was usually if I sat for like half hour or less, then it might be a problem when I tried to stand up. But yeah, it wasn't really a serious problem for me. It did happen sometimes. But you generally, if you sat long enough, they would go away. But it may be that Austin here has, like the circulation in his legs is somewhat different from mine. And so you may want to, you know, try different postures. Like if it's like the full lotus that's causing your leg to fall asleep, then you might try the easy position where instead of folding up like this, your feet are just kind of in front of each other like this. That's called the easy position, sometimes called the Burmese position. Or if you're doing it that way, you might try getting into like a half lotus or a quarter lotus or eventually the full lotus. But yeah, you might want to like change up your sitting posture. Don't totally wimp out and sit in a chair though, unless you've got like a doctor's certificate giving you permission to meditate sitting in a chair. So let's see. I mean, if it's not really hurting you, then you might want to just tough it out. You know, it's like it would be an ascetic practice of letting your foot go to sleep every time you sit in meditation. And it may be that you'll earn good karma through the austerity of that, which will then cause you to rise above the situation or some such. And with that, I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Power. And Power says, you said in your video that monks need to have their genitals intact in order to be ordained. This may sound silly, but to what degree does the junk need to be intact? Let's say a monk or would-be monk had a tumor and had to have a testicle removed. Would that be disqualifying? Would circumcision be disqualifying too, since the foreskin is removed? Well, with regard to a male, like a monk, as set aside nuns for now, you don't even have to have a penis. I mean, a monk who cuts off his penis there's a story in the rules of monastic discipline about a monk who is so tormented by lust, he just wants to remove the temptation, he cuts off his penis. And then the Buddha scolds him and says, instead of cutting off one thing, you cut off something else. And then he made it a tulachaya offense, which is a grave offense to cut off your own penis, but he was still a monk. Because in order to be a monk, you have to have balls. And I don't think it says anywhere in the text how many balls you have to have. I think one might be enough. I would assume that one would be enough, although I'm no authority on how many balls it takes to be a bhikkhu. I don't know if anybody, I've never really heard this, I've never seen this issue discussed in like monastic literature. But so long as you have at least one ball, I assume that would be enough. But I mean, it's not the penis, it's the balls. You have to be an intact male in that respect. Because if you lose both balls, you are technically a eunuch. You cannot be a monk anymore. Even if you are ordained, you stop being ordained because you are a eunuch, not a man. according to ancient Indian Buddhism. So, and that's like one reason why you could not revive the Bhikkhuni order by having 5 monks do like a sex change operation to transition over to trans women, because it wouldn't be instantaneous. It would have to be instantaneous in order for it to be valid, because if there's any kind of intermediate stage between man and woman, like once the balls come off, that's it. You're a eunuch, and you're like essentially excommunicated. You are no longer ordained. So, but again, I'm not 100% certain whether 1 ball is enough. But I assume it would be. I would guess that 1 ball would be enough. But something like circumcision is it's just not a factor. Because I read in, I think it was like Time magazine long ago, I think it was back in the late 90s, back when Time magazine maybe was still doing like legitimate journalism, that there was a special medical unit in Bangkok, Thailand, that specialized in sewing penises back on, because Thai men tend to be rascals, and their wives, it was almost like a fashion trend. Their wives were getting revenge by cutting off the penis of these monks, or not monks, but their husbands. And some of these husbands who could not get it sewn back on again by this special unit, like she'd throw it down the outhouse, or in one case, she just threw it out the window of the hut, and then a duck came up and ate it, and then just waddled off, and he couldn't get it. So some of these men who are suddenly without a penis, they ordain as monks. I saw one picture of one of these dickless monks, and he had like a disgusted look on his face. I mean, it was definitely not a spiritual vocation for him to be a monk. He was just making the best of a really shitty situation. So, and also with regard to nuns, I mean, it is kind of embarrassing. You read some of the rules about what kind of woman is allowed to be a fully ordained bhikkhuni or nun. And if she's got like some female bodybuilders that take like anabolic steroids, they've got like a clitoris that's like, good sized, they're disqualified. They're not allowed to be ordained as a nun if they've got a large penis-like clitoris. And you can read this stuff yourself if you find a translation of the rules of monastic discipline. Note that many of you would be fascinated by such information. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. That's what I'm just going to do. And this is from Fred. And Fred says, can we have the link for what did the Buddha really say? I do think that it is on my new website now, which, if I'm not mistaken, would be panyobasa.org, and it would be in the links below this video. So if you go to the links below this video and you find something along the lines of panyobasa.org, if you click on that, you should be able to find the essay, What Did the Buddha Really Teach? It's not what did the Buddha really say. The title is What Did the Buddha Really Teach? And it's an essay that I wrote back when I was a monk. I think all the essays on the panyobasa.org website are my earliest Buddhist essays before I started blogging. So you should be able to find it there. And with that, I move on to the questions of Twin Wasabi. And Twin Wasabi says, I see you're a big Styxhexenhammer fan. You even have some memorabilia of him, like that coffee cup. They're better without the wings, by the way. Like the Ouroboros. I just don't like the ones with the wings. Anyways, Twin Wasabi continues. I remember him from 10 years ago when he was pretty small. What made you attracted to him? I was a monk living at a monastery in California, and one of my main supporters, really nice guy named Aaron, told me about Styxhexenhammer. This was back, I think it was like 2016 or so. And it was back when Styx still had the leather jacket with no shirt and was sitting in his kitchen, I think, with like the SPQR Roman flag behind him. He hadn't been married yet or anything like that. So that's, it was recommended to me by a supporter of mine. who had similar political views, I guess. And I liked Styx. I still like Styx. I mean, with regard to certain things, he is not really an authority. Even with regard to his occult stuff, he kind of specializes in the occult, but I don't know, just for some reason, I just don't resonate with him at that level. And whenever he talks about Burma, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. I have to admit. But with regard to seeing the big picture politically, like what's going on in the world, he's better than most at being able to see the big picture. So that's mainly the advice of a friend, plus watching him and liking his attitude, his ability to see the big picture and so forth caused me to like Styx. And usually I watch him every morning before I go to work. So I'll just move on to Twin Wasabi's next question. Have you seen Rageaholic? He gives me the same vibes as Styx, so you'd probably like him as well. No, actually, I've never seen Rageaholic, but I might look him up as a result of this recommendation. So thank you, Twin Wasabi. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pyramid. And Pyramid says, any thoughts of the criticism of Theravada Buddhist temples being racist? I've read on your favorite website, Reddit, that some Buddhists switched from Theravada Buddhism to Mahayana because they said the Theravada temple monks were racist against them. Well, I think in Burma, there are quite a few racist people in Burma, which, I mean, from their point of view, it's like they are nationalists, ethnic nationalists, they're traditionalists, and they just assume that being Burmese is the best ethnicity there is. It's in a way, all countries should kind of be this way. But anyways, the Burmese, they just assume that being Burmese is the best, that if they really like a European person or an American, a Western person, sometimes they'll say, you've got good parami. You might be reborn as a Burmese person next time in your next life. That kind of thing. Or you must have been Burmese in your past life to be able to be a monk like this. They just consider being Burmese to be really just like the pinnacle of humanity, aside from being a monk, which is even higher than being an ordinary Burmese layperson. But so, I mean, some of them can be kind of racist, but it's not like a hostile racism. It's just like they think that their race is like really excellent. And so their racism might take the form of just being like condescending, where they just assume that because you're not Burmese, you don't know anything. And they'll explain to you just the kindergarten basics of Buddhism. Even I, as a senior monk, would sometimes have people trying to explain to me how to meditate and who Mahasi Sayadaw was and all this kind of stuff. They just assume that foreigners don't know anything. Pa Aut Sayadaw, one of the most famous monks in Burma, just has this idea that all foreigners have wrong view. Only Burmese people can understand Dhamma correctly. And it's mostly like educated and upper class Burmese people have this assumption that only Burmese people can really understand Buddhism correctly. And they're so dogmatic that sometimes I wonder if even they can understand Buddhism correctly, because they're just stuck in this level of words in books. So let's see. So some Buddhists switched from Theravada Buddhism to Mahayana because they said that Theravada temple monks were racist against them. Some of it might just be a misinterpretation of the situation. If you go to like an ethnic temple, you go to a Burmese temple or a Thai temple, mostly they're going to be speaking Burmese or Thai. The lay people go there as a kind of cultural center. They go there to speak their native language and eat their native food and do their native ceremonies. And Westerners, even though they might be welcome, just feel out of place there. They just don't fit in, even though the people might be really friendly, maybe a little condescending, but friendly, welcoming, but it just doesn't fit. So they might have misinterpreted that as racism, or it may be that they were just loony leftists. I mean, after all, they're on Reddit, who are able to see microaggressions that others cannot see. And in which case, if they wanted to leave Theravada and join Mahayana, then that's fine with me. I got no problem with that. But yeah, I have met a few like Burmese Theravada Buddhist monks who just didn't like foreigners. But as a general rule, they stay in Burma. They're not going to be coming to another country where they're surrounded by foreigners. I mean, it's just kind of stupid if you're racist to then move to a country where almost everyone around you is this race that you despise. So it could be something like a misinterpretation or just sort of a benevolent racism where they don't hate you or despise you or want to genocide you or whatever. They just think that to be their ethnicity is superior because, of course, they've got Dhamma and you're living in a spiritual Siberia or whatever. So I hope I answered that. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Drunk Druck, and he says, how many times do you think you've said, so I'll just move on to the next question? And I guess I answered that question. Well, gosh, let's say 1,005. That is my guess. That is how many times I guess I have said that. So I'll just move on to the next question. 1,006. I guess I answered that question. So, next question is from Blondie. And Blondie says, my question is about the handful of leaves sutta, where the Buddha says that what he has shared with the monks is like the leaves in his hand. I'm checking to make sure that I'm recording here. Okay, it says we're recording. I always got to do that at least once, generally more than an hour after I've started doing this. I'll check to make sure I'm really recording. And so now I got to start over with Blondie here. My question is about the handful of leaves sutta, where the Buddha says that what he has shared with the monks is like the leaves in his hand, but what was revealed to him upon enlightenment is more like all the leaves in the forest, and what he left out would be of no benefit to leading a holy life, putting an end to suffering and all that. Are there any clues at all elsewhere as to what the other stuff was that was revealed to him was about? Any clues? Well, I mean, he couldn't have just said it, because then it would be one of the leaves in his hand and not one of the leaves in the forest all around him. Maybe some clues would be like the psychic powers that you attain upon Buddhahood, becoming a Buddha. One of them is just seeing all beings going according to their karma. And he wouldn't be like talking about that a lot, but I'm sure he'd be sort of like Neem Karoli Baba up on the altar up there, who, I mean, when they look at you, they just see right through you. They'd see your past lives. You know, they know you better than you know you. They would be able to see levels of your consciousness below what you are aware of, at least below what your conscious ego is aware of. So, I mean, that kind of thing, you know, he might be able to see, you know, your karmic situation and so forth that he won't be talking about. It might not be necessary, it might be irrelevant, but still he would know that kind of stuff, presumably. But aside from little clues like that, the other stuff that was revealed to him, you know, it'd be like an aspect of his functional omniscience. You know, the Buddha, according to tradition, was functionally omniscient. He wasn't like a fully enlightened Jain, like a Tirthankara, I guess they're called, where he would know all things at all times. You know, his mind would contain infinite knowledge at all times. He wasn't like that. But if he directed his mind towards something, if he wanted to know something, he would know it. And so there'd be all kinds of other stuff that he wouldn't be talking about. You know, he'd want, gee, is it going to rain tomorrow? You know, something like that. I mean, he wouldn't be talking about that kind of thing. Or, you know, he'd be aware of the thoughts of the teenage girl sitting in the back who's just like thinking about the boy sitting, you know, a couple people away from her. You know, he just let it slide. You know, he'd just keep giving the sermon or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, it would just be all sorts of things that he would presumably know. According to tradition, I mean, he was functionally omniscient. And so most of that has nothing to do with Dhamma, really, or becoming enlightened, or how to help somebody else to become enlightened. And so, I mean, he just wouldn't spend much time talking about it, if any time talking about it. So I'm just going to move on to Blondie's next question, which is, Ajahn Sumedho says that enlightenment can never be a personal accomplishment because it's a constant letting go of conditions and identities in the present. Persons exist in the realm of time. This is tremendous as a wisdom teaching because people today can hardly be present for 5 seconds without distracting themselves with some shite. But it's a terrible way out of suffering. It would be better to go to a hospital when your leg is infected than to let go of your annoying anxieties about the gangrene eating your illusory flesh. Any thoughts? Well, I mean, if you know deeply enough that it is illusory, then I mean that can cure you right there. I mean, that's apparently what Jesus was doing, certainly what Mary Baker Eddy was doing as the founder of Christian Science. The Christian Science is largely based on the idea God is good. God would not create anything bad. Sickness and injuries are bad, therefore God did not create them, and they just don't exist. It's just a kind of delusion in your mind. And so they just refuse to believe that there is such a thing as sickness or gangrene. And probably a lot of Christian scientists have died of sickness or gangrene that they denied existed. But others who had a little bit more faith, I mean, you read there's the last chapter of Mary Baker Eddy's Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures is called Fruitage, if I remember correctly. And it's 100 testimonies of people who were cured miraculously through Christian Science. And a lot of it is stuff that is largely psychosomatic, like trouble with their vision, trouble with their digestion, even tuberculosis, which is largely psychosomatic, or asthma, largely psychosomatic. I mean, when I say that tuberculosis is largely psychosomatic, I don't mean that there's no, what do you call it? It's like a bacteria that causes the tuberculosis in your system. They're not saying that, in a way they kind of are saying that it doesn't exist, but still, when I say that it's psychosomatic, I'm not saying that it's just purely made up in your imagination and makes you feel sick, that it's just like your mental states are determine how susceptible to tuberculosis you are. Sort of like asthma also, I've read it's like 90% of cases of asthma are purely psychosomatic, or also like herpes. A lot of people know if you're like experiencing a lot of stress, like psychological stress, you're more likely to get herpes. And it's sort of like that with tuberculosis also, that if you've got like a strong mind, you're less likely to come down with tuberculosis than if you're like stressed out and like in a state of disequilibrium. So anyways, after that long digression, I mean, a lot of the cases were this kind of stuff, but I mean, there's one of the first cases was a woman cured herself of a 40-pound fibroid tumor. She was reading Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, and then it was like she had this epiphany. This is true. My sickness doesn't exist. And she just was running around telling people that she's cured even before the 40-pound tumor had completely dissolved, but it just disappeared in relatively short order, and she was better. Another one was a broken bone. A guy had a broken arm. He just refused to see a doctor or anything, and it got better. And then later, for some reason, a doctor did examine him, and whether he was okay having a doctor examine him or not is another question. But the doctor said, well, you had your arm broken at one point, but it was set perfectly. It's completely healed at this point. So, all this was a long digression with regard to somebody with an infected leg. So, which was just like a little example in this question given by Blondie, which just demonstrates my capacity for tangential thought. So let's get to the main question here, though. I mean, the main question is, any thoughts? So I guess that would be answering, because it caused me to go off on this tangent about Mary Baker Eddy. Let's see. Ajahn Sumedho says that enlightenment can never be a personal accomplishment because it's a constant letting go of conditions and identities in the present. Well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, enlightenment is not a personal accomplishment because ultimately there is no person to become enlightened. It's the realization that there is no individuality that is an aspect of enlightenment itself. So nobody really becomes enlightened, which is kind of paradoxical, but there we are. So let's see, this is tremendous as a wisdom teaching because people today can hardly be present for 5 seconds without distracting themselves with some shite, but it's a terrible way out of suffering. It would be better to go to a hospital when your leg is infected than to let go of your annoying anxieties about the gangrene eating your lose or your flesh. Any thought? Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think from a spiritual point of view, you'd be better off dying with equanimity than living in a state of like superficial materialism and anxiety and worry and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily true at all. If you could be fully enlightened and die of gangrene, it would be better from a spiritual point of view anyway, than being perfectly healthy, just like a superficial unenlightened normie. So, yeah, that's some thoughts that I had with regard to this. And I mean, there's a lot more that I could say, but there's like more than 50 questions. So I guess I should be somewhat concise, especially after spending 5 minutes digressing about Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science. Although Mary Baker Eddy also did say, it's easier to cure somebody of cancer than it is to cure them of a bad habit. Because people like their bad habits. That's why they became habits in the first place, whereas not very many people like cancer. So their desire to let go of the cancer is much stronger than their desire to let go of whatever their bad habit is. So I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Raphael. And Raphael says, what are the best books you know that can free me from scientific materialism? Well, that's kind of an interesting question. A book on parapsychology, The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen. I keep pushing that book. That's a good one. The Science Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake. That's a good one. Or like completely different kind of perspective. Miracle of Love, stories about Neem Karoli Baba, who was just this amazing miracle working sage who lived in India back in the 20th century. And even if most of the stories about him, of these miracles that he performed, were just made up in people's imagination, I mean, if just 10% of them were true, then he just stands scientific materialism on its ear. And a lot of the people, I mean, they're spiritual people. A lot of them are Westerners, like doctors and so forth, who, I mean, they seem to be trustworthy people giving trustworthy accounts of this mind-blowing stuff that Neem Karoli Baba would do. And it was part of his way of teaching people. You know, he'd get some Westerner just locked into the Western point of view. And this happened to Ram Dass also. Ram Dass was one of these Westerners just locked into a scientific materialism kind of view. And then Neem Karoli Baba would do something or say something that would just completely blow their mind. You know, they'd just be in this state of, I mean, just like tilt or error or something. And then when they're in that state, it was much easier to kind of, you know, ease them into a more spiritual, more profound understanding of reality. So, I mean, blowing people's mind was something he specialized in. So let's see. Let's review, shall we? Best books I know that can free me from scientific materialism. Any good book on parapsychology would at least be kind of a foot in the door. You know, it might not cure you of it because it's still a scientific kind of book, but still, you know, it's at least getting the door a little bit open. Then Rupert Sheldrake, you know, for example, the Science Delusion. And the main science delusion is that science already understands reality pretty much. They just have to fill in a few more blanks and they'll have it all worked out. That is a delusion, that some of the beginning assumptions of science are already, you know, they're not correct. And let's see, what else? What else did I say? Neem Karoli Baba is, oh yeah, and The Trickster and the Paranormal, which gives a very elegant, in my opinion, theory of how the paranormal works, how the rules, can be broken. That, like empirical laws of nature, the laws can be broken. They're just, it's just sort of like a stable configuration of energy. We've got these laws of physics and so forth. It's stable, but it's not the only possible way. And you can, once you get to a certain level of like mental power, let's say, wisdom, let's say, then you can actually change the rules to some degree. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. So I'm moving on to Raphael's next question, which is, did the Buddha ever say that it is wrong to associate with people with extremely wrong views? Some Buddhists found it wrong for Ajahn Punadhammo to live stream with someone like Brian Rue, who adheres to the violent ideology of National Socialism. Well, first of all, I would say that Brian Rue does not adhere to any violent ideology knowingly, because Brian Rue, he really does think that all this stuff against the National Socialists and Adolf Hitler especially is propaganda. Anyone who has seen the propaganda against Donald Trump now might be able to appreciate a little more Brian Rue's attitude towards just the way the establishment has demonized Adolf Hitler. Although I don't go as far as Brian Rue does in that regard, because it's pretty obvious that Hitler was really an opportunist. He would break promises. He would make promises in order to break them at the nearest convenient opportunity. Like his peace pact with Stalin, for example, or his promise with regard to the Sudetenland would be his last. After he gets the Sudetenland, or after he gets Danzig or whatever, he's done. He's not going to do any more expansion, anything like that. But he does think that Hitler, the Holocaust was, to the extent that it happened, Hitler didn't know about it. That's what Brian Rue believes, or has believed in the past. He doesn't talk much about Hitler anymore. So he's definitely not adhering to any violent ideology. He is a devout Buddhist who definitely endorses non-harming. It's just that he is a conspiracy theorist, and he thinks that the demonization of Hitler and National Socialism in general is just, it's like the establishment demonizing someone who doesn't play ball with them. And it does happen to some degree, as anyone knows who sees how Donald Trump has been treated by the establishment. But I don't think Adolf Hitler was all that great of a guy. He would have been very interesting to hang out with sometimes. Just go to one of his dinner parties or something. It would be fascinating, I think. So let's see. I just digressed again. So did the Buddha ever say that it is wrong to associate with people with extremely wrong views? Well, in the Mangala Sutta, which is one of the main paritas or protection chants in Theravada Buddhism, it's a list. The sutta contains a list of 38 blessings, 38 great causes of great fortune. I guess blessing is a good term. Or what's the other one? There's another word that I'm trying to think of. Auspice, something like that. And number one, the number one blessing in the Mangala Sutta is not associating with fools. Asevana sa balanam, asevana cha balanam. We're non-associating with fools. So mainly a fool is a person with extremely wrong views. Among other things, they have weird attachments and all kinds of other things too. But yeah, you would generally say that someone with extremely wrong views, especially along an ethical line, would be a fool. So he did say that you're much better off not associating with fools. And the second blessing in the Mangala Sutta is to associate with the wise. Because mental states are contagious. If it's just a matter of historical fact or like mathematics, something abstract, something like that, something that doesn't really reflect upon your virtue as a person. You know, you can be grossly mistaken with regard to, you know, some aspect of history, for example. And I mean, that's not going to really be a reflection on your virtue as a person. So something like that is not a big deal. But the Buddha did warn, like, the Ajivakas. He warned against the Ajivakas more than once about how they believed in strict determinism. And the Buddha says, you know, that kind of belief, you can go to hell for that if you seriously believe that stuff, because it's with regard to beliefs that have an ethical basis with regard to, you know, how you're going to cultivate wisdom, how you're going to be a better person, that sort of thing. And being mistaken about some political figure, whether it be Hitler or Chairman Mao or Abraham Lincoln or whatever, then, I mean, that's really not that big of a deal. I think some Buddhists found it wrong for Ajahn Punadhammo to live stream with Brian Rue. Yeah, I mean, Hitler has been so demonized that, yeah, anyone who would not speak ill of Hitler, I think, would run afoul of some people. But then Ajahn Punadhammo, he was boycotted by a lot of people just for speaking out against taking certain injections that were almost mandatory, and in fact were mandatory in certain parts of the world just a few years ago that I shouldn't specify. But he did lose a lot of support just for being outspokenly opposed to mandatory certain kinds of medical treatment, you know, against people's will, that kind of thing. So, yeah, to some degree, the Buddha did say it's wrong to associate with people with extremely wrong views, but that's with regard to extremely wrong views with regard to, like, how to cultivate wisdom and how to walk a spiritual path. Being mistaken about a political leader who lived almost 100 years ago would be largely irrelevant. You know, some people would say, you know, King Ajatasattu wasn't that bad of a guy. I mean, maybe it was just a conspiracy theory that he murdered his own father and became king as a consequence and so forth. Who knows? But it's largely irrelevant to Dhamma anyway. And so I'm going to move on to Raphael's next question, which is, what do you think of the following monks who are influential in Burma? And then he left a link to an article about the Khomenis of Burma. And this article actually mentioned a few monks that I actually have met. One that I spoke with a little bit, especially Unandamala Biwamsa, who was the abbot of a school monastery on Sagaing Hill in the city of Sagaing in central Burma. He's a very nice guy. He's a very mild-mannered monk. Anyways, this article was essentially bashing some of these monks, mainly because they support the military government. But, I mean, one warning sign is that this article was posted by Atheist Alliance International. So, I mean, they're going to have a dim view of monks in general, I think, because they're atheists. They don't like religion all that much, apparently. What would be the point of being an atheist who respects religion and religious leaders? So he's got like different famous Burmese monks and just has like a paragraph or two explaining why they're bad. And like Thetagu Sayadaw, one of the main arguments against Thetagu Sayadaw, who I've also met in person, is that he spoke out against same-sex marriage. And I mean, what do you expect of a conservative religious leader? I mean, all major religions consider homosexuality to be immoral. Buddhism less so than certain other religions. I mean, Buddhism doesn't declare the death penalty for homosexual people, but nevertheless, it would say you're better off not being that way, just from an ethical position. And so, I mean, to say that Thetagu Sayadaw is bad, partly because he does not favor same-sex marriage, and partly just because he is supported and supports the Burmese military government. I mean, it does kind of make sense that you kind of, for a monk, to get along with the government rather than oppose the government. My preceptor, Venerable Hlaintet Seattle, he was very naive with regard to the government. He was pro-government, pro-Burmese military, and just would not believe the stories against them about how they're shooting people in the streets and so forth. Also, one of the senior monks in the Tampulu tradition who might still be alive today, he used to be a soldier before he was ordained. He was like a low-ranking, like a lieutenant in the army or something like that. And so he had ties with the army. The army supported him. He got along well with the army. And so there was kind of no problem there, I guess. And monks really aren't supposed to be like political agitators anyway. They're supposed to renounce all that kind of stuff. So it does make sense from a traditional Orthodox and Buddhist point of view that you get along with the government and are not like protesting in the streets against them. With regard to Sayadaw U Nandamala Biwamsa, who was the teacher of a friend of mine in Burma, the main thing that they said against him was he was against modern science because he preferred the traditional Buddhist explanations of things, which are pre-scientific. And I mean, a lot of Burmese people won't even believe that the earth is round. They believe the earth is flat because that's what the ancient texts say. And Venerable Nandamala Biwamsa, he was very intelligent. He's got the Biwamsa suffix at the end of his name, which means he got some award for his great learning. He just prefers the traditional Burmese or the Buddhist, ancient Indian Buddhist explanation of like cosmology and so forth. So he got dinged for that in the article. And also, of course, he gets along with the government and is not protesting against the government in the streets. So what do I think of the following monks who are influential in Burma? Well, I do not have a high opinion of Thetagu Sayadaw. I used to fantasize about snubbing Thetagu when I was a monk, because he really is extremely lax with regard to his monastic discipline and so forth. But U Nandamala Biwamsa, I've got nothing bad to say about him. He seemed like a very soft-spoken, mild-mannered monk. He could have been very wise. He was certainly brilliant. He was a brilliant scholar. So, yeah, I think that this article was definitely written by some flaming leftist who was just bashing monks for various reasons. And I don't take it very seriously. Although some of the monks are better than others. I definitely had more respect for U Nandamala, who was on the list, than for Thetagu Sayadaw, who was also on the list. But Thetagu Sayadaw, he was another monk, very high profile, one of the most famous monks in Burma, if he's still alive, who was speaking out against Burma being taken over by Muslims, for example. He did not like Muslims. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And we've been talking here for over 2 hours already. By golly. I don't think we're going to go for 3, though. I think despite my long digressions, I think I'm actually being a little more concise than usual. So anyways, Rui says, I've rephrased the question. Yeah, he asked a question that I didn't understand. So then he rephrased it. Do you think the conditioned and the unconditioned are like two straight parallel lines that never cross to infinity? No, I don't think that the conditioned and the unconditioned are like two straight parallel lines that never cross to infinity. If you're going with like Euclidean plane geometry, the conditioned would be lines in general, and the unconditioned would be the plane. If you go with three-dimensional Euclidean geometry, you could say that the conditioned would include planes or just surfaces, and that the unconditioned would be three-dimensional space. See, you start off with the absolute, which is everything, and then when you divide it up into parts, that's when you start getting samsaric conditioned stuff. So the block of marble is the ultimate, and the conditional virtual statues that exist in that block of marble are the conditioned. They are samsaric. So that's how I look at it. So I'll just move on to Rui's next question. Also, how could cessation or extinction be a vessel, the uncarved block of latent infinite proliferation? Well, cessation or extinction is describing nirvana in a psychological or ethical sense. There's two main ways you can interpret nirvana. I mean, literally, nirvana means blowing out like a candle flame. So maybe the oldest definition or the oldest meaning of nirvana was just becoming enlightened, which was like a psychological, ethical kind of a state. And it may be later on, or maybe it was sort of a coalescing of different traditions, that another meaning of nirvana was in the metaphysical sense of, the ultimate reality or the infinite formless consciousness that is unmanifest and it's the infinite, unmanifest, luminous all around, etc. So there's two different ways of interpreting nirvana or nibbana, the ultimate or the absolute. And so the cessation, let's see, I'll just ask the question again. Also, how could cessation or extinction be a vessel, the uncarved block of latent infinite proliferation? Well, the cessation is the cessation of the imaginary statue, which just leaves the uncarved block as the reality that remains. Or it's the cessation of believing this statue is real. So you're stuck in this belief that there's a statue in that block of marble that is ultimately real and separate from the rest of the marble. And then finally, when you get cured of that delusion, then it's just the uncarved block of marble, and you're no longer attached to a belief that that statue in there is ultimately real in and of itself. So the cessation is the cessation of latent infinite proliferation. So how could cessation or extinction be a vessel of latent infinite proliferation? Because it is the latent infinite proliferation that ceases with the cessation. I hope I answered that question. I guess I answered that question. Although it's a kind of question that a lot of people just have great difficulty in wrapping their head around it. Because, as I keep saying, you have to be able to deal with two different levels of reality simultaneously. That nibbana and samsara are not at the same level of reality. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, I assume you are very much against smoking tobacco for bhikkhus, but when it comes to different chemicals influencing the mind, tobacco has less effects than other allowable chemicals like caffeine and sugar. Caffeine and sugar have more effects to mind and also has strong attachment and toxicity. What would you say? Well, I'm not entirely convinced that sugar, for example, has more of an influence on the mind than addiction to nicotine. That someone who smokes 2 packs a day on the one hand and maybe eats X number of Twinkies per day on the other hand, if you stop eating the Twinkies, I don't think you're going to go through physical withdrawal to the same degree, the same amount of craving that you would from smoking 2 packs a day for 10, 15, 20 years. I could be mistaken. With regard to caffeine, it is a drug, a mind-altering drug, but it's not a mind-altering drug that leads to heedlessness or cloudedness of mind. So it wouldn't fit under the 5th precept, in my opinion. It can be that some people will experience mild withdrawal, like headaches, if they drink like coffee all the time and then just stop. But I still don't think that would be nearly as bad as the withdrawal, the physical withdrawal and craving of trying to break a nicotine addiction. I think not eating sugar and not consuming caffeine would be much easier after several years of doing it than not smoking would be. And it's just common sense really, that according to the second noble truth, all suffering is caused by craving. And so obviously, if tobacco had existed in the Buddhist time, he probably would have banned it because it's conducive to craving. I mean, somebody like Ajahn Mun, who was a chain smoker, according to report, then, I mean, he was literally, if he was enlightened, then he was enlightened and a drug addict at the same time, which is, I'm not saying that it's necessarily impossible. I mean, maybe it was. Maybe he was an enlightened drug addict. But nicotine is an addictive drug. Certainly not as bad as fentanyl, but still, I think it's worse than caffeine, but that's just me. I mean, it's better and worse are value judgments anyway, unless you give some specific context in what way they are better or worse. So, yeah, I am skeptical that caffeine and sugar have more effects on the mind and also cause strong attachment and toxicity, I mean, to the same extent as nicotine. But, I mean, the Buddha he didn't know so much about processed sugar. He may not have known about caffeine, since even tea wasn't drunk in the Buddhist time in India that I'm aware of. He might have known about certain stimulants like ephedra, which some people are saying was the Vedic drug soma. But I mean, he knew about honey, he knew about palm sugar, that kind of a thing. And so, I mean, in his functional omniscience, in his great wisdom, he did not say that eating sugar is wrong or should be avoided or should be against the rules for monks. But I'm pretty sure, I imagine that if tobacco was known in the Ganges Valley 25 centuries ago, the Buddha would have banned it for monks. Just saying. That's just my opinion, though. And I'm going to move on to Nature Cure's next question, which is it authentic practice of Buddhist teachings that Thai Theravadins meditate all night up on Uposatha Day? Yeah, it's called Vigil, I think. And some of the monks will kind of help themselves through their night-long vigil by drinking Red Bull or some such, which reminds me, I got an energy drink here. I might as well crack it since we're on the subject. So is it authentic practice of Buddhist teachings that Thai Theravadins meditate all night upon Uposatha Day? I don't recall it being mentioned in the texts, but it's certainly not against Dhamma. It's not opposed to the text. I don't think there's anything about meditating all night long that would be like denounced by the Buddha. I just don't think so. So, I mean, it might not be specifically mentioned or advocated in the Pali Suttas or in the Vinaya, but it's not obviously against Vinaya either. So I don't think there's any problem there. So whether that means it's authentic, I mean, it's an authentic practice of Buddhist teachings. To the extent that it's not opposed to the Buddhist teachings, you might call that authentic. But if it's not specifically mentioned and endorsed, then maybe it's not authentic. I guess it would depend on your definition of authentic. And so I'm going to move on to Nature Cure's third question, which is, would Myanmar ordained bhikkhus have to reordain again if he chooses to stay at Thai Theravada monastery in Thailand? Well, that depends on what school of Theravada, what sect he was ordained in, and what sect the monastery belonged to. For example, in Thai Theravada, it is notorious that the Dhammayut sect will not do, I mean, they do not consider any other monks to be ordained, except maybe the Mun order or the Mun sect from which the Dhammayut sect was derived. But they won't do Sangha Kama or formal acts of the Sangha with most monks in Thailand even. And so that would probably apply to most monks in Burma also. Although the Dhammayuts, it seems to me that the burden is on them to prove that other monks are not really monks, that their lineage was broken due to bad, like excommunicated monks not dropping out of the Sangha. They stay in the Sangha even though they've been excommunicated, and they just keep it a secret, and then they participate in ordination ceremonies and so forth. Back in medieval times, this sort of thing was relatively rampant, and so the Dhammayut monks in Thailand just think, well, it was so rampant for everybody except us that they're not really monks anymore. Their ordination lineage has been broken. So most Burmese monks, if they wanted to live at a Dhammayut monastery, might have to be reordained if they didn't want to just get treated like novices or lay people. If they were ordained in the same Mon tradition that the Dhammayut tradition was derived from. I actually asked Ajahn Tanisaro about this, and he didn't answer the question. Maybe because I was being too confrontational with regard to this whole issue of the Dhammayuts, saying that nobody else is really a monk, only they are. That there is the same Mon sect that Dhammayut is derived from is also found in Mon state in Burma. So maybe the monks ordained in that tradition might be considered to be legit, authentic monks by the Dhammayut Sangha, and they might be willing to do formal acts of the Sangha with them. But most other monks in Burma or Sri Lanka or even in Thailand are considered not to be real monks by the Dhammayut order. But that's the only order that I know of. There's none of that really in Burma, with regard to one sect in Burma saying that we're the only real sect and all the rest are fake. I never heard of anything like that in Burma. It's only the Dhammayut sect in Thailand that I am aware of that has adopted an attitude like that. But even some Dhammayut monks, they're laid back and they don't really insist on it. And it seems to me that the burden is on them to prove, innocent until proven guilty. And I don't know how they would prove it. Maybe they can. I don't know. So, yeah, that would be the only case I know of a non-Dhammayut monk wanting to stay at a Dhammayut monastery, which is a Thai tradition. But it wouldn't be the other way around. Dhammayut monk, if he wanted to, he could stay at a Burmese monastery, and the Burmese monks wouldn't care. Unless they're racist against Thais or something. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mara Maid Mahayana. And Mara Maid Mahayana says, I had just returned to Germany from child-friendly Greece and was sitting on the train home from Stuttgart with my wife and our small child. Two old people ordered us to leave the train compartment because our child was supposedly too loud. She is 2 years old and has had a long journey and has been very well behaved up until then. I quickly became aggressive and had thoughts of wanting to hurt them because I don't show this kind of behavior towards other people. This incident upset me all evening and the next day. It feels like in moments like this, all the Buddhist books I have read and the Buddhist wisdom are suddenly gone. Your advice? Well, you do not have control over what arises in your mind. It arises, going with Orthodox Buddhism, due to the power of karma or kama. So what arises in your mind, you really don't have control over that. Even a fully enlightened being would not have full control over what arises in his or her mind. But how you deal with it after it arises, you could be mindful, just watch it arise and pass away. And then let's say it was like a really icky thought that left like this really bad aftertaste. It causes you to feel bad. Then you got to be mindful of that too. You just relentlessly mindful would be the correct Buddhist way of dealing with it. You certainly don't want to act it out and start punching heads, which apparently Mara Maid Mahayana was not going to do. But no matter how much you practice, you still don't have control over what arises. It's past karma that is conditioning these reactions to come up. And so if you remain unconscious, you just follow the automatic pilot, you're just going to act out what these urges tell you to do. Whereas if you're more mindful, you got more wisdom, a little philosophical detachment, then you can watch it arise and not act upon it. But it can still happen. So that's really the practice. The practice is not having angry thoughts arise, for example. The practice is when the angry thoughts do arise, you don't act upon them and you don't just nurse them. You don't sit there fantasizing. Even though you're not punching heads, you're not going to sit there fantasizing about punching heads. So, that's the practice right there. Just be mindful of it when it arises and be as detached from it as possible. When you're being mindful of anger, let's say anger arises. If you're being mindful of it, then it's not you being angry anymore. It's just anger is arising. And if you are anything, you're the one who's observing, not the thing being observed. So it's just this mental state that's arising, and you're just watching it arise and pass away. So that is the practice. And I'm going to see what this is. Oh, okay. Somebody's going to be coming over later this evening. So you're going to be hearing beeps of texts coming, and he's going to be asking me what's going on. And I'm not going to be answering him because I'm answering yous guys. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question, so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is also from Mara Maid Mahayana. And he says, the older I get, the less I want to have to do with other people. For me, other people outside my family mostly just mean dukkha. The people at work, the people at the gym, the people on the train, etc. I don't feel like discussing or interacting with others anymore. I just want my peace, and I realize that you can only have that in solitude or alone. In my opinion, it's clear to me now why only bhikkhus who live in solitude can fully awaken. Thoughts? Well, it's not necessarily only bhikkhus who live in solitude. It can be easier for most people to cultivate wisdom if you're living in solitude, just because there's fewer distractions. But in my case, I'm kind of the opposite. I used to despise the human race as a general rule when I was a young man. And now I've got more compassion for people. I'm more accepting of people. Still not completely accepting, but I do have more sympathy with the human condition now. Partly just because, like I've explained before, I tried as hard as I could to be a saint for many years, and it just didn't work. And so, how is somebody who isn't trying to be a saint going to be, properly behaving, properly thinking person? It's just, I have more compassion for them after trying to be a saint for decades and just not being able to manage it. And then it's like, well, how's a normie who's working in a plywood mill or something, or working in a bakery or something? He's got a wife and 4 kids and all this stuff, and he's living in a culture that does not promote enlightenment, really. What chance does he have? I have more sympathy, like more karuna, more compassion for people now. But let's see. I got to go back to the question here. Yeah, if you don't really have much interest in interacting with people, that's fine. I'm pretty much the same way. Even though I just said that I've got more compassion for people, I'm more accepting of the human race now. Still, when I'm at work, I don't stand around socializing much. I might crack a joke every now and then. You talk about what needs to be done at work and so forth. But for the most part, I mind my own business and do my job. And I just like it better that way. I don't want to stand around talking about good restaurants or movies and that kind of stuff. It's just, I'm not really much interested in that. So, let's see. I just want peace. I realize that you can only have that in solitude or alone. In my opinion, it's clear to me now why only bhikkhus. Yeah, if that's the way it is for you, then you might attend to that and, try to cultivate some cultivate some solitude. Apparently you've got a wife and a kid, So, I mean, you're not going to be totally solitary unless you just abandon them. And I'm starting to have these urges. I hope that you'll forgive me, but I'm going to give a quick text to the friend of mine who's coming over just to let him know. Let's see. I don't type really fast because I don't do that swiping thing. Let's see. Okay. All right. So, yeah, I mean, definitely Buddhism endorses solitude, viveka. You know, like Vivek Ramaswamy, his first name means solitude. So, that's the friend who's going to be coming over later. Let's push that farther away so the beeps aren't as loud. And if he calls, I get the Godzilla ringtone, which is nice. Let's see. Okay, I think I answered that question. I apologize for being distracted in the middle, but that's what happens when you don't live in solitude. See, you get distracted. And but I mean, just living in solitude there's certainly no guarantee that you're going to make better progress, because if you're living in solitude, you can just start drifting off into eccentricity. You don't get feedback from other people, and so you can just start drifting without even noticing. Then you just become like really weird. That can happen too. So it is good to have feedback from other people. And somebody can tell you, I mean, if people keep telling you, you're really an asshole sometimes, then you might want to start listening to that and think, wow, maybe I am, even though I can justify my conduct. It makes perfect sense to me. Other people are seeing me as an asshole. And so it's good to kind of introspect and think, well, maybe I should do something. So, I mean, whatever your situation is, you're always in a position to practice Dhamma to some degree. So you do the best you can, and you make the most of what you've got. And if you're a householder with a wife and a kid and a job, then you just do the best you can under those situations. Under that situation, you can still be mindful. You can still be moral. You can still listen to Q&A videos. You can still contemplate Dhamma. You can still meditate, I hope. You know, you get at least 30 minutes in when the baby's sleeping, that kind of thing. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. Mara Made Mahayana asked another question, a third question, and then before the first two, which are actually the second and third ones, he said, you know, disregard the other ones. So I will disregard the third one, because we are going well over 2 hours as usual. In fact, 2.5 at present. So with his permission, I'm going to skip over the question about weird karma of people getting stabbed and so forth. But if he likes, I can answer that one first on the next one. And I'm just going to skip over to a question from Anthony. And I don't know if he's expecting an answer to this. It was somebody asked me, Drunk Druck, in a previous Q&A, asked me about drinking 175 proof whiskey. And I thought, 175 proof whiskey? I've never heard of such a thing. Yeah. So anyways, Anthony says, there are spirits that go up to 190 proof. Why do you find 175 proof whiskey so hard to believe? Well, 190 proof is pretty much pure grain alcohol. And I have heard of rum that's like Bacardi 151, that's 151 proof, but never in my life have I heard of whiskey that's more than like 110 proof, you know, like 55% alcohol by volume. So I've just never heard of it. And it would seem like it would just be pure grain alcohol with a little bit of malt flavoring contaminating it. Know what I'm saying? So yeah, the thing is, I find 175 proof whiskey so hard to believe simply because I've never seen or heard of anything getting close to 175 proof in the realm of whiskey, is why. So then Anthony says, speaking of in your previous vid, when you were talking about your experience with cigs and whiskey, you mentioned that you did not inhale the cigarettes. Is that supposed to be a Bill Clinton reference? And I noticed that it could have been a Bill Clinton reference, but it is true. When I was when I skipped school in 4th grade with my stepbrother Chucky, and we hid inside of a parked train at a park and smoked some cigarettes that we stole from my stepfather, his father. I didn't inhale. I really did not. And that was long before I ever heard of Bill Clinton. I was the one who originated not inhaling. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Criel. Oh, Criel, that's throat warbler mangrove. I think we already answered one of his. So I messed up and didn't include his second question with his first question, which is generally what I do. It's like once you ask a question, that's in chronological order, but every other question, even if you ask them much later, they always wind up in the same bundle, the same clump, the same coagulation, if you will. So anyways, Criel, also known as throat warbler mangrove, says, is it lying to convince your son that Santa Claus is real? And yeah, it actually is. It seems to me, I mean, lying is when you are deliberately deceiving somebody. And when you tell your kids, you should always tell the truth and, don't chew with your mouth open. And, when you're done using something, put it back where you got it and all that. You teach them the basics of simple morality. And then you feed them this cock and bull story about this 4th century Anatolian Christian saint who is somehow still alive and has moved to the polar ice cap with some beings from ancient Germanic mythology and some levitating caribou who flies around the world giving presents to everybody in one night. I mean, you can say that, some lies are worse than other lies. So, telling kids about Santa Claus is kind of a white lie. It's sort of a benevolent kind of lie. But still, you're deceiving the kid. Besides, if we're Buddhists, what does Santa Claus have to do with Buddhism? In Burma, they talk about Saka, King of Gods, Thajia Min, who has 2 books. One is covered in dog hide, and that's where the names of the bad kids go. And the other one's covered in gold, I think, and that's where the names of the good kids go. And I don't think he goes around delivering presents with or without the levitating caribou. But still, he's got the books. He knows who's naughty and who's nice. But it may be that a lot of the adults actually believe that stuff because they have largely a pre-modern worldview. So it may be that the parents are just making an honest mistake telling their kids about Thajia Min and his 2 books where the naughty kids and the good kids go. But yeah, technically speaking, all the stuff about Easter bunnies and tooth fairies and Santa Claus and all that, it's, you're deceiving the kids. I don't think anyone's going to go to hell for that. But there is going to be a certain disillusionment when your child becomes old enough that other kids are going to be explaining to him that it's all bullshit. It's just a way of parents keeping the kids under control. It's their way of controlling the children. Like a lot of atheists say about religion. The purpose of religion is for the government or the status quo to keep everybody subjugated. So Santa Claus is like that, I guess, to certain radical children. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin, or Skuladin. And he says, he's got 3 questions all about the Lord of the Rings, which is kind of strange. But he says, is the One Ring a karmic capacitor, a battery that holds a temporary charge, usually to get something started? And then as a little commentary, he says, it seems that whenever a person held the ring, their mental states changed or buckled under the will of the ring, and they were becoming a slave to karma, which must closely resemble the One Ring's creator, Sauron. Well, I don't think so. I don't think that Tolkien was thinking about capacitors or batteries or anything like that. It'd be more like the more traditional, like folklore kind of idea of like a magic sword. It's got some kind of secret name like Glorendry, and it might have some sort of demonic being or other being like trapped in the sword. And when you hold on to it, it's like you can't let it go and it starts controlling your mind and taking you over. I assume it would be something more along the lines of, some kind of traditional folkloric sort of explanation than capacitors and batteries and that kind of thing. So that's one answer. 2 to go. Skoladin says, why was Smeagol unable to fulfill the One Ring's full potential? Unlike Frodo or Bilbo, Smeagol had almost no mental resistance, and upon seeing the ring, he violently murdered the previous owner of the ring, who had been a member of his own family. Well, I think that Smeagol just was too inferior of a person. He had less virtue. He had less strength of character, and so it just took him over really easily. Whereas with Bilbo Baggins, it kind of took him over to some degree too, but Bilbo had more of a grounding in virtue. I guess Hobbit cultural conditioning is more conducive to that than whatever kind of being Smeagol was, who became the Gollum. I don't think Smeagol was a Hobbit too, was he? I don't think so. Maybe he was. It's hard to tell when they shave the tops of their feet. That's pretty much the diagnostic feature of hobbits, other than their small size and so forth. So let's see. I guess I answered that question about Smeagol, why he was unable to fulfill the One Ring's full potential. Yeah, I think he was just an inferior vehicle. He just did not have the moral backbone or whatever, even though the moral backbone kind of becomes an obstacle, but still you have to have the strength to like not be destroyed by the energy of this thing. And so the third question is kind of a joke question, I think. Is elf a corruption of the term ilf? And then his commentary is, in the first part of Lord of the Rings, after Gandalf explains to Frodo the dangers he had unknowingly inherited and that Frodo would have to go on a suicide mission and leave everyone and everything he ever knew behind, Sam barges in after eavesdropping and volunteers to join his quest because of his obsession with Ilfs. The Elder, or the Eldar, were described as fair, beautiful, and ageless immortals, so I assume that unlike the daughters of Eve, they would just be referred to as Ilfs, since they were incapable of the prefixes which denote further physical maturation, which would be MILF. So I guess the implication here is that elf is like a corruption of MILF, or that MILF comes from elf or some such. And I don't think it works that way at all, that elf comes from like some old Germanic language. And MILF is an acronym referring to something. So yeah, that was kind of a joke question, and so I won't really go in depth in my explanation on that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we are getting pretty close to the bottom. For those of you who are starting to get nervous, or maybe you're starting to feel the urge to pee or something, just bear with me. And we should be done in about 3 hours. Not from now, but from the beginning. And this is from Sam Papalapa, who used to be called Indian Guy and probably still is occasionally referred to as Trevor. And Sam Papalapa says, when in meditating, I get that piti feeling, I think. Feels like energy surging through my arms and legs, like a hit of very, very weak crack. But it's like I'm about to enter really good meditation, but I can't handle the feeling because it's so sudden. It's hard to get past it, and my mindfulness kind of breaks because it's so weird. I like it, and one time I was able to get through it, I think. I don't really remember what I did, but it was awesome. So I'm kind of chasing that dragon. Any meditation advice on how to get past that? Well, I mean, the obvious answer is mindfulness. It's like when you're being mindful, like in the moment, when these rushes of joy or pleasure or exhilaration come up. I mean, it is difficult not to get excited by that, not to just get washed away by it, and then you lose the concentration. But ideally, whatever arises, you just note it and let it go. Note it and let it go. If it's pain, note it and let it go. If it's pleasure, note it and let it go. If it's some weird sound, just note it and let it go. Whatever it is, whatever arises that is perceivable, note it and let it go. But some people do have problems with that. I used to know this guy. He was really a good guy. He had his own construction company. And he had this ambition to just get rid of it all. You know, he liquidated his company and went off to Burma and was ordained as a monk. And he naively had this idea that within about 5 years, he'd be a Sotapanna. Then he could drop out, come back to the West and become a teacher. But what happened was he went to Pandita Rama. He was ordained there. And he would get drunk on piti. He apparently had good concentration. He would get into deep meditative states, but he would just get like plastered on this feeling of pleasure and exhilaration until he would just get like drunk on the joy of meditation. And he just started like cracking up a bit. I mean, he'd just be laughing uproariously, and, you know, just weird stuff would happen. You know, it's like weird coincidences would just have him just breaking out laughing in relatively serious situations. And finally, the abbot, U Pandita, just told him, like, no, this is just not working out. You're going to have to go home. So he had to dropped out of the monkhood, went back to America. I don't know what happened to him after that, but it really was too bad, because he was really a good guy, and he was serious, at least with regard to wanting to renounce the world temporarily. You know, he got rid of his business and everything. But it can be a danger for some people. Other people, your progress is slow and painful. You know, there's like 4 kinds of spiritual progress. There's fast and painful, slow and painful, fast and pleasant, and slow and pleasant. So slow and pleasant, I mean, that might be someone who's getting a lot of PT, but it's like derailing their meditation over and over again. I was sort of grinding with the slow and painful path a lot of the time anyway. But getting back to the original question, the thing to do really is just be as mindful as you can when it arises. Don't let it just sweep you off your feet, so to speak. Just observe it mindfully. Just note it and let it go. Note it and let it go. And the more you practice that, the better you'll get at it, until finally you will master it, the God's willing. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, also from Sampapalapa, formerly known as Indian Guy, and sometimes presumably still called Trevor. And he says, do you think that we can fall into ignorance even with Buddha's teaching still existing in samsara? Or do you think that it would have to be gone completely for us to fall into ignorance as a whole? Well, if you got the Buddha living in the Ganges Valley, 25 centuries ago, I mean, people in southern India are going to be completely ignorant of that. People in North America are going to be completely ignorant of that. People in Japan, people everywhere, except some places in the Ganges Valley. And even the people in the Ganges Valley, some of them weren't Buddhists. They didn't care. There's just this new cult leader called Gotama that, most people they didn't become Buddhists. In fact, some of the people that did become Buddhists, like the group of 6 monks, they were just foolish rascals regardless, even though they were in the presence of the Buddha himself. But they were like what the Dhammapada says, a fool is like the spoon that sits in the bowl of soup and never experiences the flavor of the soup. That if you're just a foolish person, then the wisdom of a Buddha may not be enough to help you very much, that you might just be closed off to it. You just got this shell of foolishness protecting you from liberating wisdom. So let's get back to the question. See if I answered this question, because I'm not entirely sure at present. Do you think that we can fall into ignorance even with Buddha's teaching still existing in samsara? Yeah, obviously. Most people have fallen into ignorance. At least they're not getting any better just because Buddhism exists in this world. Even Buddhism itself has been changed radically. And there's a lot of just silliness that the Buddha himself probably would have denounced that is included in various schools of Buddhism at present. So, I mean, do not underestimate the power of human stupidity. Let's see. Did I answer the question? Yeah, I think I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Proto-Pseudo-Monk. And Proto-Pseudo-Monk, he's elaborated now. He usually has like a little heading for a question and then the question, but now he's got the heading for the question and then like a little synopsis, like what is it called, like in a scientific paper, the abstract. And then he's got like a more elaborate version below that. So the title of this question is Karma, Meditation, and the Brain. And then the main question is, how does karma affect our meditation and our progress in the Dhamma? And then the commentarial elaboration is, given the neuroscience evidence of how meditation substantially changes the brain, one might argue that the deepest meditation can only happen after, say, 20 to 30 years or 10,000 plus hours of formal practice. If karma and rebirth are true, and one has advanced in meditation across many lifetimes, their brain structure may not reflect that one of deep meditations. Rebirth is a reset of the brain, potentially removing all progress. How does the neuroscience of meditation fit into the paradigm of karma? Well, how does the neuroscience of meditation fit into the paradigm of karma? It really doesn't. I mean, at least you can put forth a good case that it doesn't. It's more like, I mean, neuroscience does not condition our karma. Our karma conditions neuroscience. Our karma allows us even to hear about neuroscience, and our karma is going to determine what theories of neuroscience we're going to be exposed to, and to some degree, what theories of neuroscience we're going to believe. So neuroscience is just like the materialism stuff that, at least according to me, isn't ultimately real. I mean, karma also isn't ultimately real, but it's closer to reality than physical matter is. We have no direct experience of physical matter. All we know is our own mental states. You know, like this cup. How do I know this cup is here in my hand? Well, I see it, I feel it. It's all mental sensations. It's sensory data, which is mental. That's the only way we know that this cup is here. And if we get rid of all the mental states, the cup just poofs out of existence. It just merges with void. And neuroscience is the same way. Karma, at least, you're getting into something mental. So you have more direct experience of that. Let's see, the main question, how does karma affect our meditation and our progress in the Dhamma? Well, it's as your karma becomes more subtle, you become more wise. It's as the mental states become less crude, you've got less of a shell keeping you unenlightened. You know, it becomes more porous, maybe a little more translucent, ultimately transparent. Your mental states, I should say. So, given the neuroscience evidence of how meditation substantially changes the brain, yeah, well, I mean, our karma has landed us in a universe where we've got this thing called neuroscience studying how meditation substantially changes the brain. So let's see, karma and rebirth are true, then one has advanced in meditation across many lifetimes. Their brain structure may not reflect that one of deep meditation. Well, I mean, there are some kids that are just prodigies, like Neem Karoli Baba up there, who I keep referring to. He just ran away from home and renounced the world when he was a kid. I mean, he already had the parami, so to speak. He had the momentum going, and he had enough wisdom that he was aware of that momentum. So rebirth, not really a reset of the brain. I mean, kind of, it can be, but then again, you're going to have a different brain that's conditioned by the karma you had in your previous life. And so you make progress in your previous life, you're going to wind up with a more, more spiritual brain, a brain that can meditate better in a culture that maybe promotes meditating, that kind of thing. So it's a matter of talent talent you're born with, which is largely an aspect of karma. So I kind of answered that. So I'm going to move on to the Proto-Pseudo-Monk's next question, which is entitled Jhana, Vipassana, Mindfulness, and Nibbana. And then the main question here, the abstract, the condensed version of the question, what is profound progressive meditation? Which I don't really understand. So we're going to have to rely on the more elaborate explanation of the question here. You mentioned in Q&A number 19, back when my Q&As were relatively short, that fourth jhana is the closest to nibbana an unenlightenment being can experience. To me, it sounds like you are suggesting progress in the Dhamma is only deep meditation and is equivalent to fourth jhana, but you always leave out vipassana. What about mindfulness, satipatthana that leads to vipassana? Is this not contemplation or a deep meditation state? Could you please clarify how these terms jhana, vipassana, mindfulness relate to the progress of profound meditation states that lead to nibbana? Well, yeah, it kind of leads to nibbana, although that also is paradoxical because nibbana is unconditioned and has no cause. So there's also that. Let's see. Where do I grasp this question? Let's see. Sounds to me like you are suggesting progress in the Dhamma is only deep meditation. No, progress in the Dhamma is not only deep meditation. That eventually you may have to have at least a moment of deep meditation to become enlightened, but that might be like the moment before you become enlightened. That some people apparently can just have this happen to them after living a virtuous life or whatever, and then just having something catastrophically slam them out of their samsaric rut and into a higher state of consciousness. So let's see. I always leave out vipassana. Yeah, well, vipassana is the insight that arises. And I have mentioned a number of times, like one of my favorite suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the Lesser Discourse on Voidness. And a monk is cultivating voidness or emptiness, sunyata. So the first thing he does, he leaves the village monastery or whatever, and goes out alone into a forest. That's the first increase of emptiness because all the artificial hubbub of humanity is left behind. He has the relative emptiness of a forest. And then he starts meditating and he starts getting into deeper and deeper meditative states. He gets all the way past fourth jhana. He enters into the signless concentration of mind, animeta chitta samadhi, which is, the implication is that it's even higher than fourth jhana. It's the highest possible meditative state you can achieve. And then when he comes out of that, he realizes even the highest possible state that can be cultivated still has a beginning and an end. It's still conditioned. That's not it. And that's like the insight. That's the vipassana that arises. And then it causes him to just sort of give up, just let go of the whole samsaric edifice. It's like he realizes that you get into the highest possible meditative state that is possible to humans, possible to any conscious being. That's still not it. And then it just causes you to, in a way, just give up and let go. And boom, there you are. Because enlightenment ultimately is effortless, even though it might take a hell of a lot of effort to get to that point. So, yeah, the vipassana is definitely necessary. The liberating insight is necessary. And just fourth jhana is not enough to do it. Although it gets you closer, it's sometimes in the text it's referred to as temporary liberation. But it's not permanent liberation. It's still conditioned, has a beginning and an end. So let's see. What about mindfulness, satipatthana that leads to vipassana? Well, the satipatthana, when you're just being mindful of everything, then, that's keeping you in a undistracted state, keeping you in a more meditative state, and you're not reinforcing all this old karma of just having the inner monologue going and just being distracted and deluded and unenlightened all the time. It's making your mind more clear, more simple, more quiet. And then, of course, fourth jhana, according to the text, the stock definition is purity of mindfulness. So you reach the ultimate of satipatthana, the ultimate of mindfulness anyway, through getting into really deep jhana states, deep meditative states. So, see, is this not contemplation or a deep meditation state? Well, Vipassana isn't necessarily a deep meditation state. I mean, you have to be perceiving to some degree, I guess, but it's sort of like a Zen koan or something where you're using perception to like get you beyond perception. Like the Mahayana Sutra, I can't remember which one it is, says the purpose of Lord Buddha's teaching is to liberate us from our thinking by means of our thinking. And so Vipassana is kind of like that. Let's see. Could you please clarify how these terms, jhana, vipassana, mindfulness, relate to the progress of profound meditation states that lead to nibbana? Well, jhana is controversial. People do not agree on what jhana means. My opinion is it's like the 4 stages of meditation. That first jhana especially is not necessarily, or was not originally necessarily, a superhuman mental state. Vipassana is just the insight, these flashes of knowledge that arise as a result of getting into a subtle or a paradoxical kind of a mental situation. That it's just all of a sudden you're seeing things from a new perspective, or you're seeing things from a different dimension or something. And mindfulness is really just, in a way, shutting down your thinking mind while you're still functioning, shutting it down as much as you can manage by just not keeping the inner dialogue going, not interpreting everything, but just staying at the level of raw data as much as you can. Or at least if you're doing like satipatthana of like mindfulness of, all of your postures, all of your activities and so forth, any mental state that arises, anything like that, anything perceivable. In the seen, there's only the seen, in the heard, there's only the heard, etc. So, but actually, I mean, the definition of jhana is kind of controversial. And, there's the orthodox traditional definition of jhana, and even that is kind of controversial because teachers just cannot fully agree on exactly what that means. And then you've got like my own preferred interpretation, which would be more along the lines of like something G.C. Pandey would say in his book, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism. And I sincerely hope I at least knocked a dent into answering that question, because we got lots of questions and I got to move on to the next one, which is from Wayne. Sorry, Wayne, for keeping you waiting for 3 hours, but who knows? Maybe you just fast forwarded or skipped through the other answers that you weren't interested in. So anyways, Wayne says, this concept of no self is tricky to understand. If one deconstructs the body through contemplative investigation, it's obvious no self can be seen because consciousness, mind, or spirit is invisible. It has no shape or form, yet it is. There must be a conductor or a pilot to our experience, for we continuously must make decisions throughout our lives. If we say consciousness, mind, or spirit is not a self, I'm okay with that, but to say consciousness, mind, or spirit is not who we are, then I'm totally confused. Comments, please, and thank you. Well, at the samsaric level, that's who we are, but at the ultimate level, there is no differentiation. Also, let's see. There must be a conductor or a pilot to our experience, for we continuously must make decisions throughout our lives. Yes, but those decisions have a cause. If they didn't have a cause, they would just be random. And that'd be more like an epileptic seizure than free will. I mean, the assumption here is that if we make decisions, there must be free will, and therefore there must be a self, because you can't have free will without some individuality that's separate from the rest of this web of causes and conditions. So, I mean, the decisions that are made according to a reason, or a bunch of reasons. a whole web work of reasons, conditions, if you will. So there must be a conductor or a pilot to our experience. Not necessarily. I don't think so. It's like the even at the level of just orthodox Theravada, you have a decision just arises as a mental state, which is conditioned by karma. And then this ego, which is just a group of perceptions, just thinks that it's separate from the rest of reality and thinks that it's actually calling the shots, when all you have to do is try to control your mind, and you see that it really doesn't work that way. Even a fully enlightened being does not have full control over his or her mind. I mean, that's one of the main teachings of the Buddha's second discourse on the marks of no self, the mark of no self, Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. So, I mean, at a samsaric level, the level of doors and windows and dogs and trees and clouds and all that, then yeah, we have a self and we make decisions and all that. That's fine. At the ultimate level, there is no differentiation. There is no individuality. There is no distinction between this and that. And they're both like superimposed upon each other. Just like the various imaginary statues are contained within the undifferentiated, uncarved block of marble. And so, with that, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is the last question. It always catches me by surprise. Sometimes I'm thinking, man, I hope we're at least 85% of the way through. And boom, I'm at the bottom of the scroll. And this is from RPAD, RPAD, which I think is a French word. And RPAD says, did the Buddha ever mention that compassion can be misused, abused, or misplaced? And I would not at all be surprised if he did. I would not be surprised if it's in the suttas somewhere. But I just don't recall any sutta or passage in the suttas where the Buddha is saying that compassion can be like miccha karuna, like wrong compassion. You know, you can have right concentration and wrong concentration. You can have right mindfulness and wrong mindfulness, right view, wrong view. But I don't recall the Buddha talking about right compassion and wrong compassion. So I think that compassion in and of itself is going to be a kusala mental state. It's going to be a wholesome, good, skillful mental state. It's going to be good karma. And still, you can have compassion that goes awry. You can have good intentions. You know, the road to hell and all that is paved with good intentions. But still, I mean, you're mixed. You've got this compassion, which in and of itself is a good thing. And it's mixed in with all this delusion and foolishness that kind of, I mean, it can cause the compassion not to seem so good after all. And I think that happens a lot in, like, especially leftist politics. I'm sorry to bring up leftist politics at the end of this Q&A, but there is a lot of like feminine kind of compassion that actually makes things worse in the long run. So, you know, it just vitiates or like emasculates a civilization where you're trying to like have everybody taken care of and make it illegal for anyone to do anything dangerous so that nobody gets hurt and all that. You know, treating American citizens or the citizens of whatever country as children that should not be allowed to make their own decisions in certain cases. I mean, even though they might not be causing any harm to anybody else. But I guess that's just what governments do, you know. That's just one of their purposes, is to prevent us from doing certain things, even though it might not be harmful to anybody but maybe ourselves. So, getting back to RPAD's question, again, I really don't recall the Buddha ever mentioning that compassion can be misused, abused, or misplaced, although it apparently, just based on empirical observation of the world around me, I can say that sometimes it is. You know, like the childless cat ladies who get involved in politics and try to fix everything so that everybody's taken care of and nobody gets hurt, and it just sort of stops the survival of the fittest aspect that like drives evolution and drives improvement and excellence. That kind of thing. So, yeah, but I don't recall the Buddha ever mentioning it, although just because the Buddha didn't mention something doesn't mean that it isn't true. I don't think the Buddha ever declared that, you know, the cube root of 27 is 3, but still, the cube root of 27 really is 3. Even though the Buddha didn't say it, probably. And that's it. That's the end of the Q&A. By golly, we survived another one. At least I did. Some of you out there might be dead by now, but I'm still here. And I'm going to go over there and watch my snail very shortly. But before I do that, then just bear in mind, if you have questions about Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, meditation, Burma, monasticism, me in particular, anything like that, any question you think I can answer, possibly, you think there's a good chance, at least a 50-50 chance that I can answer a question, feel free to ask it in the comments below, and try to keep your questions down to a maximum of 3, which might be shortened down to 2. Pray that I do not reduce it further. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already, and be happy.